Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today, and I am very happy that it is so, by my dear old friend, Jolly Scholar 888. Before I jump in and introduce him properly, or rather allow him to introduce himself, I'm going to roll through some quick boilerplate stuff. I was going to ask how the audio and images are, but Cinders, our merry moderator, thank you very much, Cinders, is telling me that the audio is good. So if there's anything going on with sound or image quality, let me know here at the outset very quickly. Thank you for checking this out. I am Oliver Perrin. This is Semiagog. Please follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as the old sister channel, which has lain inactive for some time, but has a whole bunch of content that's not over here. It's on YouTube and on BitChute. It's called A Safer Space. Please also follow me over on Odyssey. Follow me on Telegram. Follow me on Gab. I'm also on Twitter, but I'm currently suspended. I'll probably talk about that another time in a live stream. I could unwind all of that, were I willing to simply... how shall I say this delicately? If I were willing to get on my knees and suck it, basically recant, basically confess, and click the little delete button acknowledging that something they claim is hate speech actually is, then I could turn it back on again. But I'm eventually probably going to knuckle under and do it. But right now it's just so irksome. Anyway, please check out Jolly Scholar's channel too. Look down in the description box below. You'll see a link for his channel. I recommend it highly. He's got some great stuff on folk music and Pete Seeger. He's got his insights here that we're going to be talking about, with the idea that socialism is eugenics. Gerard is definitely more of the libertarian stripe. But don't hold that against him. He's a dear old friend and comes up with all kinds of great ideas that I've always enjoyed. And check out my books. There are links in the description below for Vinculum. It is a science fiction story set in 2076 in Istanbul, where a book thief is pursued by an esoteric sect of assassins and remorseless corporate hitmen. You can get that Vinculum over on Amazon under the name Oliver Perrin. Links below. There's also my collection of poems. Good. Thank you, sir. My collection of poems called Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth. That's under Oliver Timken Perrin, and you can get that over on Amazon as well. So that does it for me, brother Gerard. Oh, nice. You got it there at your place too. A man of taste and distinction. Yes.
That's it. Yeah.
Before we get started, maybe you can just sort of quickly introduce yourself for everyone. I've had you on my channel before, but if people, didn't catch that and want to know what you're about, what your channel's about, maybe you could give them a quick introduction. And I will pour myself delicious chocolate milk.
All right. Yeah, well, as you can see, I'm a codger.
We're both codgers, yes.
Yeah, but I was born in another century. Maybe you were too. At any rate, so most of my memories are in another century, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I was been a musician, artist, the kind of person that grows up in the I still love Burning Man. So I've grown up among all the liberals. I'm surrounded by them. And so that's kind of given me, I think, a really insight into what I'm doing, because my first degree was classical guitar. Then I went on to philosophy at St. John's, and then I went on to ethnomusicology and ritual studies. So,
and you got your doctorate there as
well.
Yeah,
my PhD is in studying in Spain, Spanish music and ritual in Andalusia. So it gives me a really good insight coming from these two sides, but also the fact that my family on my mother's side is Cuban. I lived in Cuba when I was a child. I was right there at the tail end of the revolution. So I've had a really good opportunity to watch things firsthand. By the way, I lived in Venezuela. So so that's really why I kind of say, okay, it's worth me to make a video channel, because I think I have something to say. Otherwise, why bother, right? And so that's what I've been working on, just in fits and starts, while I change my lifestyle so that I can devote more serious time to it. By the way, I just went to a flamenco a dance show last night. What are those? They're kind of like all the belly dancers and all the trying to do an international,
Right.
women through the ages, and it was actually quite good. But they used a piece of mine. They used La Mora, and the dance that we danced to
Nice.
it was Yolit, which you may have. I don't know if you know. She's a very good flamenco dancer. I put it up on my Facebook. She did a very good job, especially since it's not a flamenco piece, right? So the poor girl was trying to why are they having me dance to this? But she did a really, really good job. She's very good. So that's the kind of
Nice.
thing I still have my foot in the arts and in flamenco and all that. Although, as you well know, we're, if we open our mouths, we're total outcasts.
Yeah, not being right there on the cutting edge of the forces of progress. But so if I were asked to summarize you, other than an old friend, I would say you're first an artist and a musician. In a really basic sense, more artist than musician. I remember your playwriting and your playing around with poetry and
Driven
writing
by
in general.
mysticism, really, driven by the fact that there's something beyond, that you got to go find meaning to. And art is one of the best ways to do that, short of becoming like a mystic priest, or, which I flirted with a lot of people, go be a Buddhist in a temple, something like that. So you had to put on leather and become a rock and roller if you don't do that.
Right. So then beneath that fundamental aspect of art and mysticism, I would gloss you really quickly, just straight up as an anti-communist. And I guess that probably ties with your mention of Venezuela and Cuba and having seen those things unfold. And then third, tied into that cluster, I would call you a scholar, but kind of in that order.
Scholar and a gentleman.
Well, indeed. And
yeah, I would say the anti-communism just kind of comes with the territory as you just look around. I've told you that story again. My cousin Armando comes over here, and after after being here a number of years, seeing what the changes, he says to my mother, "Cita, ¿a dónde voy?" Like, now where am I going to go? Like, everybody who's ever been in a communist country sees what's going on here in the West, and tries to just slap people, hit them on the shoulder, going, "Do you not see this?" But they don't. They don't see it because they have no reference point. They went to the universities, of course, which is that's the real source of the rot, right?
Certainly
The
one of
swamp
them,
is
yes.
fed by the universities. That's the sewer that feeds the swamp.
Indeed, there is that dimension. Well, I guess this brings us over from talking about communism to this broader idea of socialism. You certainly have no shortage of ideas about that. You've looked into it quite a bit. And so I guess as context for this, hopefully everyone who's watching this has caught the clip I did just recently. I had it down for a little bit because I wanted to review it, as it seems it's that time again for cancellation. So I wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything in there that would get me into trouble. But it's back up now, and it's about this basic idea that socialism is eugenics.
Right.
And as I mentioned in that clip, there are a number of ways where people could say, oh, man, of course, I understand dysgenics, and obviously they're focusing on things like race or, erasing whiteness, or talking about things like bio-Leninism. There is this there is this aspect, but in a fundamental sense, you're really saying that it is always already a eugenic program. I explored the aspect of the basis, what I think is at least a basis for this, which is Stirner coming in and saying everything's relative, and there is no objective truth for you to anchor your culture, your cultural practices, your aspirational goals. There's no anchor for this, and so he's sort of created this relativistic hollow. And it's an emptiness. It's this pit that people who came after him had to confront. And so, as I laid out in that previous clip, you sort of got the idea that Nietzsche was reacting to Stirner and tried to find something like an objective basis for morality, given accepting the claims that Stirner had made about relativism. Likewise, you see that Marx went through a difficult phase of attempting to digest Stirner's thought, and as a result, he came up with a polemic against Stirner called Saint Max, and then never published it. And then instead, he sort of began right there, right on the tail end of having read Stirner's work. He began to develop with Engels the dialectical materialism. And so, to make a long story short, my angle was, if you say God is dead, and I pointed out in that clip that Stirner literally said that a generation before Nietzsche did. You know, if you remove the idea of the transcendent, you remove the idea of the great chain of being, you're left with materialism. Both Nietzsche and Marx went for that physical materialist basis. But in Marx's case, it just became this horrible flattening. Whereas with Nietzsche, he said, we can measure the value. We can conduct a valuation. We can revalue the values in terms of mankind based on the type that is produced, and therefore we can still have a transcendental aspect, but it can be anchored in things that are material and can be measured in some sense. It's a little ham-fisted, both as regards Marx and as regards Nietzsche, but you can see the fundamental thrust of it is, if you say God's dead, then you're left with the material and the physical. And so we've got this idea that that man becomes the thing that we are focused upon transforming and changing. You know, we'll have a sort of materialist eschatology, in the sense that we'll find a way to transcend humanity, transhumanism, or transcend all the barriers, break up the false consciousness, arrive at a, you know, this utopian state where it really is from each according to their ability and to each according to their needs. And we have this self-creating communist man. Anyway, for people who are more interested in that, that's the direction I took the insight. And it's not necessarily with or against what you're talking about. I saw it as being complementary. But with that long-winded introduction out of the way, the first thing I wanted to do, since you introduced me to this basic idea, is to clear the floor and let you talk about what this means to you, the aspects you've been thinking about. There are some clips you've put up on your channel about it. You know, you called it Useless Eaters 1 and 2. I think you've talked about... I'm
working on Useless Eaters 3 now, which is really where I'm going to put where I'm going. The other two are setups for this.
Okay, well then let me just shut up and listen to you sort of set forth where you're coming from with this, and then maybe afterwards we can go back and forth, open this up as a discussion, maybe take some questions from the folks. But I've got at least a couple of hours. Is that good for you?
Oh yeah, and mine's short. I mean, I'll tell you, the first thing about Marxism, and if you read early Marx, you realize that there is this kind of if you read his poetry, there's a kind of Luciferian. You know, I think what he hated about the aristocracy more than anything was that he wasn't one of them. And there's that Nietzschean thing about the cult of resentment, you know, and a certain ethnicity that was perfected it, but everybody has it. And so this cult of resentment, the idea that Marx was trying to improve humanity, I'm convinced, is just totally lie. It's a lie. If you look at the way he lived, how he sponged off of Engels, how when he did have money, he bought fancy clothes and splurged and lost the money, you know, whatever was given to him. I don't see him as a humanitarian. I see him as almost kind of a little bit, you know, rather rule at hell than be a slave in heaven. He just wants to burn it down. Remember the Black Knight? There was that great moment where he goes, "There's no reason for why this guy does it." He says, "Some people just like to watch things burn." The
Black Knight in what?
Oh, the Batman one. Remember? Huh. And it was just, yes, that it. So when I look at the first thing with communism was, oh, we want to eliminate class. And you say, well, everybody, well, that's a good idea. And we'll raise up the workers. I don't think that's what he understood, that the only way to absolute power is you must get rid of the classes. You got to get them out of the way. And we have so many examples. No pharaoh, no king, no Khan ever had the power of a Stalin or of a Mao Zedong. With Mao Zedong, he had 4 people, a little gang of 4, and they had the lives from cradle to grave of 1/5 of the human population in their hands. That's never been done before. No emperor ever had this kind of power. no Khan, no king, never.
But let me just cut in there. This part I think is very important. I want to make sure that you unfold it for everybody, me included. What is it specifically about doing away with the classes? Are you suggesting that there is some structural aspect inherent in these class divisions that that amount to hierarchy embedded in the culture?
They're massive buffers against the overaccumulation of power. Like when people talk about kings in Ireland in the old days, they say there's a king on every other valley. I mean, that wasn't a big deal. So let's look at the case of I mispronounce his name a lot, Akhenaten, the one who was bringing up
which one? The one where all the statues have been smashed and he's always shown with the pendulous lips, Ra. I'm sorry, moving into Amon. Yeah, Akhenaten.
Exactly. Okay, so you have the king, the emperor. Then you have the aristocracy. You have the priesthood. Then you have in different societies the merchants, the artisans. All of these have their own place in the society, their own claim, their own privileges, and their own defensive postures and their own defensive territory, social territories. And they defend it and they hold it. Any king has to be very careful that he does not alienate too many of those structures, because if he does, he'll get overthrown.
Hence, you're bringing up Akhenaten, where
exactly he pissed everybody off. Yet he was considered a god pharaoh. Nonetheless, he's the only one that went too far. How did he go too far? The first thing he did was with the priesthood. You don't mess with the priesthood,
right? Not just like
fascist. It's because all the people love them. Religion comes from the ground up. So every single valley, every single village, every single person had their own. This is the deity that they love. This is the one that they, their family deity. Then you go all the way up to the aristocrats. These warrior kings all had theirs. They had a relationship with certain temples. And you can say, well, yeah, they were greasing each other. It doesn't matter. There's as much religiosity and atheism among the rich as among the poor. These studies have already been done. Religiosity has no socioeconomic factor. And in fact, we saw that with the with all of the recent turmoil with the Muslim riots, the Muslim bombings, the Muslim. When they went to look at them, there was no socioeconomic factor. Some were doctors, some were sold shoes, some were salesmen. Most of them were educated at the universities. Many of them were from very good families. Osama bin Laden. There's no socioeconomic factor to religiosity. So you have all this aristocracy, many of them which were religious and had their favorite, the god that they were most affinity with. And here comes this fellow saying, okay, we're going to have one god over all of them. I will be the head. I'm the god king. I'm the god pharaoh. And we're going to have Ra. And it's going to be one major god, and all the others will be subservient, will be secondary to that if they worshipped at all. And right there, the people went so against him that the only reason we know he existed is because when they build walls and temples and things in Egypt, they fill it with rubble. Well, they tore up all his statues, all his hieroglyphics, and they threw it into the rubble. So he was discovered by total accident. That's how much they wanted to wipe him out of history.
Right. And he also pissed off the scribes. And I have many times heard this before. Hell, you probably heard it from me.
Everybody.
But we have seen, and I make this comparison in the past about the jealous scribes.
Right.
And I put it in that the Church of State poem. But the might of jealous scribes thrives, disavowed and unseen. They're behind the scenes. And so when, and you well know this, when Lenin took control, you've got a bunch of these people who aren't particularly old with no experience of political power. They're better at running from the police or, in Stalin's case, robbing banks than they are running governments, right? And so they discovered very quickly that they could cut the head off the beast, but they had to maintain the bureaucracy. I believe that to a considerable extent, we saw that in the French Revolution too, but don't quote me. The one thing that I think we can take away from this is the idea that, like cockroaches, metaphorically speaking, the bureaucracy somehow, the clerk, cleric, scribe, bureaucrats,
university graduates, they're the new working class,
right? And so this is a fundamental group that even the wildest and by comparison with most successful revolutionaries played hell with eradicating. So I'm bringing this back around to your point about removing the classes.
Right.
Because this is one that persisted.
You've created two classes. There's the ruling elite, the party. And as you know, in every communist country, that's where they get that 1%. It's always right about 1% that are members of the party, of the entire population. And in that 1% is the even tinier, down to 1 or 2 to 5.
So that's your inner and outer party kind of idea.
Yes. And so you have to be invited. So the only people that get invited into the party, you can imagine, you have to really brown nose. I mean, you know, regardless of what color you are, you'll have a brown nose there, or else you don't get in. So there's no buffer to absolute power. A pharaoh could not order the killing of a priest without careful consideration. He couldn't do it. In fact, he might not even succeed even if he ordered it, because a general might not do it. They have to be very careful. You learn that in the military. Don't give an order that's not going to be obeyed. But to an absolute Stalin can say he could kill anybody, anyone. And all he had to do is say it. He could kill anyone. This has never been achieved. So the first thing you do is eliminate the classes. How did he do it? You get the working class because it's the biggest class. It's the easiest to mobilize. They have the least to lose and the most to gain. And so you play them up. And that's what they did, because as soon as they came to power, look what they've done to our blue collar, which that would be a whole nother discussion, right? The massive success of the blue collar in America was amazing. And you've seen what they've done to them, right? Shove them with fentanyl, ship their jobs off to China, replace them with immigrants, and replace them with college graduates. But that's a whole nother story. So now we have no classes, no barriers to absolute power. And the whole purpose is to engineer the population. And that's what we're in the midst of now. We're being engineered right now. And that's why I did that last video where I don't really care about abortion. I don't care one way or the other. It's just that what struck me was, after looking at the history of abortion and seeing that all of the women's rights for 150 years wanted nothing to do with it. They thought it was criminal. Even Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, wanted nothing to do with abortion. She wasn't a Christian, and she still thought it was abominable. She thought, it's a criminal act. You're killing a person. And then Victoria Woodhull, which, if anybody has never read about her, this lady was amazing. She was a riot.
Yeah. We don't have to go off on too much of a parentheses, but there is a fundamental aspect of all boomers, and you actually being a boomer. I think it's coded in there. I'll allow you to defend yourself.
I never knew about her before.
But no. But in this, you kept mentioning how they were really interesting radicals, and they were really impressive. Yeah. And to me, I'm just like, we've got another resentful lesbian. So
no.
I mean,
no, you got to read about it. They weren't resentful at all. They were very interesting. Especially Woodhull is fascinating. But at any rate, so what happens is that none of them were for abortion. They all thought it was terrible, unanimously. There was none. And then I went over and looked at the radical feminists in England who were linked up with anarchists, and they were actually bombing things. They were bombing buildings, bombing churches, and they still weren't for abortion. So I had to ask myself, well, what the hell? What was this change about? And then my whole thesis there was they needed to get a program. Now, this is after Margaret Sanger is gone. They want always, there was to be a eugenics. Oh, by the way, all the Planned Parenthood people were socialists, all of them, including Sanger. They were socialists. Most of them were Fabians, which is arguably them and the cabal. I don't know which is worse, but whatever. So they knew that socialists want eugenics in the center to re-engineer humanity, and it must be government, obviously. And what I've watched now is, to me, abortion was simply a tool. They needed to get a government. They needed to get their foot into the government, and they managed to do it. They grafted into the women's movement, which before no women wanted it. They promised that it was going to do all these goods, and it's done nothing. And I kind of went over that in pretty much detail in the video, that it's accomplished none of the goals, right? Safe, rare, and legal. Safe, legal, and rare. And it always was fairly safe. I mean, this myth about all these people dying and stuff from abortion is crazy, because it was legal throughout most of the time. Rare, I've already pointed that out. It's an industry. It's unbelievable how big this industry is. You're talking about millions and millions of abortions. So then why did they sell it, and with such fanaticism in the universities?
And just to make sure you get it in there, because you covered it in your video, but I think we need to know it here. So if you could kind of quickly tap that too. When? You also identified when that happened.
Yes, in the late 60s. Nobody wanted it until then. And of course, I was alive then. I'm watching what's going on. The communists are now openly declaring their conquest of the universities. This is where it's coming out of. And they sold it to all the youth that this was incredibly important and empowering. And if you look at it in the last 40, 50 years, it's done nothing. The people of color, Black people, it's a catastrophe. 70% of Black girls are single. The point that I make is that motherhood is never a problem. Motherhood can't be considered a problem. You're suicidally stupid if you say that. But single motherhood is a problem. Socioeconomically, it is. And that's what has gone unabated. The role that abortion has played in that is not really clear, but certainly with abortion being completely legal everywhere, we know I pointed out in the last video what it was in the last 10 years. There's been like 3 million abortions in the Black community, which is 28% of all the abortions, and they're 12% or 16% of the population. It's crazy. Then you look at what's going on in the society, and I'm not saying that's the only cause, but it's sure, a lot of people are pointing that out. The single motherhood is the biggest problem. So it's done nothing for women. So again, they still push it though, right? They fought it tooth and nail. So why? Well, all you got to do look now is with the transgender thing and look at the government. I have this thing over here. Look at it. It's something like $500 million a year just from government. And then they have from NGOs and everything, even more than that. Their budget is enormous. It's enormous. They are a feature of the government now. Taxpaying money goes to the tune of about 500 million minimal. And I think I found another source that says that that's actually too small, coming right out of the government. Planned Parenthood is now a government arm. That's my whole point. And transgenderism is now, we'll get to that in a minute. It's a government arm. It's also an arm now of the United Nations, and it's international. So now I see, at least to me, all right, that's what this was about from the start.
You certainly won't find anybody arguing that here. You're probably not familiar with it, but in these circles, you have the idea of the GAE, which has a certain homophony with another word that starts with a G. It's 3 letters, and it stands for Global American Empire. So over on this side of things, everybody understands why rainbow flags. Well, not even just rainbow flags with the transgender aspects are being raised, by governments, even over embassies. So, just to reinforce your point, I think most folks here are very well aware of that.
Right. That now we're seeing the government, and whether Roe versus Wade that's irrelevant now. It's a social fact. It's a cultural fact of acceptance, and some states will have it, some won't. But it's irrelevant. Furthermore, women's rights is just about going to be irrelevant. They're going to throw them under the bus just like they did the blue collar.
They already have, apparently.
Exactly. We see that with the athletic thing. Remember, it's a law. Pelosi put a law in place. So let's look at this transgender thing very briefly. You have a person that says, I'm in the wrong body. Now, the socialist atheists don't believe in a spirit. They're not going to talk about reincarnation, right? I mean, that's going to, okay. The body, the spirit was roaming around and boom, fell. Oh shit, I'm in the wrong body. I don't think they're arguing that. So there's some kind of dissonance. The body is producing a consciousness that's at odds with it. There's a conflict. Well, that's sure. Hell, we produce cancer, which is the body turning on itself. So I'm not arguing that this kind of sexual dysphoria doesn't exist. I've met people in my past that I could swear this guy was a girl. Okay, fine. It's very rare, but yeah, they're there. I think we all saw in school, maybe in the 6th grade, there would be one. I remember a fellow that, we've met guys that are more girly than girl. Okay, that's fine. But when you make a law that you cannot have a discussion with a therapist about, well, maybe we can reconcile the consciousness with the body first as an easier approach with far less ramifications, just on the outset that it might work. And of course, what they're saying is that 98%, some very high percentage, if you just let them go through it, they'll outgrow it. Okay, but regardless, this is the sane first step. And they've outlawed it. No. You go for the scalpel. You start cutting things. You start cutting them off, digging holes, getting out. And you have to wonder what kind of lunatic would do this. Well, what I said, a kind of megalomaniac lunatic, a people who who are megalomaniac about controlling the population. They're going to re-engineer you, whether you like it or not. And now they're in the schools. And that's the part that my next video is going to talk about. And there's it's in school health, something like that. I have it here, but I'd have to go bring it up. What it is that Planned Parenthood is putting these clinic advisories in the high schools. And there they can talk to these advisors about their dysphoria, or they can get birth control, or they can do all this stuff. And they can do it without the radar of their parents, just like the school can command other teachers to use these crazy pronouns and not tell the parents. So these things are now in the schools, and it started. There's I wish I kind of put that video up already, but these programs are now instituted in our schools, and it's against the law for them to go to the therapist and say, look, I've got this problem, I'm in the wrong body or whatever. And the therapist can't say, oh, well, let's work on this. Maybe we can get you through it. No, they can't do that. They can start talking about dispensing hormones, the hormone therapy. It's basically it ends up being a castration. I mean, we're talking about before the scalpel, they're already basically chemically castrated. So now you see how nefarious this is. And that's really the part that I want to bring about. It's accelerating right before our eyes. They're in our schools, and they're going to start. Now, did you see Tim Pool any of these videos he did a long time ago when he went to Sweden?
No.
It was very interesting because he went there. He went to Greece. It was the times when he was out in the field, and he interviewed these Swedish families. They were raising their children sex neutral. Like, that was such a good thing. But he couldn't help but notice that they got such a kick out of like, if the boy wasn't really on board with being a girl or they would go, are you sure, Johnny? Hans, are you sure? You don't like this pink dress, Hans? And he'd go, The idea was they were so tickled pink if the boy was a girl. Not quite as tickled pink if the girl was a boy, but not tickled pink at all if they didn't go, if they were just normal, especially the guy. What, you're just a boy, Hans? Wow. How cool is that? And so I'm looking at, and we can get to this later on, whether eugenics basically is spiritual, will eventually lead to a spiritual lobotomy. They'll have to go there. They'll have to, if they continue, they'll have to go there, because the last resistance to global socialism will be human spirituality. And I've argued this before in other sources, and I'll start developing it again. It's in the human body. You can't, we should be called Homo religiosos or spiritualis rather than Homo sapien, according to Mircea Eliade. So it's in the body, and eventually, it's in our nervous system, the religious experience, mysticism, all these things that people poo-poo, but nonetheless, it's every society on the planet is founded upon this. There's not a single culture that isn't. So
just a quick insert there to explain context for that. Gerard did his PhD research looking into the relationship between the mystic. Let me see if I get this right, Gerard. We've been talking about it for years, so you could tell me if my pop quiz is in any respect, my pop quiz response is in any respect accurate. You did your research on the religious experience, how it is generated, and how in turn it itself generates culture, and relating all of that to biogenetic structuralism. Is that correct?
Yes, biogenetic structuralism is the only model we have. And of course, it got ostracized immediately from the academia. It's a pretty good model. And neurophenomenology, I think it's pretty damn accurate, but it's still, it's a model. It's not proved, but it models how the body goes through different stages that eventually lead to these powerful experiences of direct communion with the universe and filled with knowledge. And if you think it's, like I've said, it could be homo delusionalis, right? We're the most delusional creatures on the planet, where they have this crazy idea where we think we can commune with the cosmos and get knowledge of our place in the cosmos, blah, 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 blah. Fine. I'm not going to argue with you on that. What I'm arguing is that regardless of how you feel about it, not one single human culture is not founded upon a ritual system, which is founded upon the varieties of religious experience. That I can say is an axiom. It's just true. Are we now in the midst of transitioning to a secular technological society?
Transitioning?
Well,
yeah. I'm making a joke about transitioning sexually because it fits,
Oh yeah.
We are transitioning after a fashion, are we not? Culturally, we're having the naughty bits cut off and new things glued on.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Eventually, if it gets serious and bad, if they really want to, because that's the greatest nexus of resistance. The resistance to globalism will come out of, and I don't want to sound hokey, but spirituality. It will be the greatest resistance. A new religion, new religiosity. That's what they look how hard they tried to eradicate that in Russia and in China, and they couldn't do it. They finally realized, shit, we can't do it. But with a new biology, they may think they can do it. And the only way to do it is they're going to have to really dehumanize us to a degree that we won't be recognizably human. So anyways, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, I like it. I want to kind of open this up because, I mean, there's so many interesting angles here, any number of them.
First the classes, now the body. And it's accelerated. It's going on right now. What they're doing to kids in our schools, they're going right for the body now.
Right. And I mean, there are a number of different ways that we can take a look at this. One is to cut away the various classes because they go with sort of the idea that, you know, Burnham talks about in the Machiavellians. There's a basic idea that it's really only competing powers that restrain power. Democracy it's a joke in terms of it being anything that restrains power in any respect. You know, the more you look at it, the more you see that democracy, not republicanism, because republicanism in some sense, a republic in that it has a constitutional basis, it locks in certain competing power structures. But the more important and more meaningful and deeper competing powers that restrain centralized power come down to these classes, you know, or the various estates, as we saw it.
In our case, it's supposed to be the branches of government with the
right. But what I'm saying is that there's something deeper.
Used checks and balances.
Well, and separation of powers and checks and balances. But what I'm saying is that in addition to that, and that is indeed based on a deeper separation of powers, which is the classes and their domains. So you can bring it back to, you know, people like Dumézil and folks looking at how Indo-European cultures break out into various castes or classes, right? Like Kshatriya and Brahmin, or, you know, the priesthood and the warrior class, all the way down to untouchables or useless eaters or surplus population or a residuum.
They never said to eliminate class. They never said any such thing.
Pardon?
They never said any such thing. They just said we're all equal under the law, but they never said that we're all equal.
Oh yeah, in our system with the founders.
They never said any such thing.
Yeah, because fundamentally it's preposterous to assert anything like that. But what I wanted to carry on is from the idea of the classes being dissolved, solve et coagula, right? Yeah. You've also got the idea of language itself with its categories. You know, first we went through the phases of dealing with you know, what we're supposed to call particular groups, and so now what you have is collective nouns that are always subject to review. And we've introduced, as I've talked about it before, we've introduced into our minds this hesitation factor between the instinctive desire to say or do and the act of speech or taking action in any way. We get, well, maybe what am I supposed to call them?
That's one of Nietzsche's main points, is that he blamed a lot of it on Plato, but definitely on, and someone is this resistant to be healthy, to not follow a healthy impulse because you've got this conscience on you going bad boy.
Right. Or then that's like a Freudian superego, right? And we don't even have to get into here how thoroughly Freud ripped off Nietzsche, all the way down to banging the woman that Nietzsche was in love with after Nietzsche had died, doubtless to some extent in order to learn what he could about Nietzsche and his ideas. There's a lot of Freudianism that is anticipated in what Nietzsche had to say about dreams, for example. But we don't have to go there. The point is that they dissolve the classes.
Yes.
They move to language where they take a look at dissolving or remaking or introducing a hesitation associated with collective nouns, which are themselves categorical designators, right? And I would argue, see, this all fits together with the transhumanism and the transgender aspect as well, because what they've gone after is a deeper, grammatically speaking, a collective noun, whether we say colored person, which is forbidden, absolutely, but we can say person of color, right? These kind of games. are dealing with the domain of collective nouns. But if you go deeper into the grammar, because as you know, as a Spanish speaker and as a French speaker, you know that these are languages with gender.
Yeah,
La, lune, le, lu, right?
that's what came with the Latinx bullshit.
Right. And so what they've done is, but they've dug deeper than that, because now they're going after a pronoun. And if you look at the depth, the grammatical depth of the fundamental structures, it's one thing to get people thinking, well, what should I call this group, right? But when you get to the level of the pronoun, you're deeper.
Mm-hmm.
You're deeper in the sense that there's more under that umbrella than just a collective noun designator,
But
right?
I would say that this is a weakness of theirs, because they actually believe that there's efficacy in that. And one of my basic problems was Nietzsche said, never confuse language with music. And one is the representative of the will. It began with structuralism. It goes all the way through the social construction of reality, the social construction.
And structuralism comes out of linguistics, of course.
Oh, completely, exactly. And so they kept going with this. And then Chomsky does his deep grammar, which nobody pays attention to anymore, because it was just an excuse. To me, it was just giving the colleges a license. So I think they believe that we language reality rather than we language about reality. And this is a real weakness of theirs, because no matter how much they keep pounding through the language, and they're going to spend so much time and effort doing it, we language about our experiences. We do not experience what we language. So the more they keep hammering us with language, and the more the average person finally starts noticing, well, wait a minute, I am not experiencing that. That's bullshit. They're telling me bullshit. They will see it. Just like they said, in Russia, they started saying, we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. And there was the one about Pravda, that they all just went along. They knew Pravda was just absolute crap. They couldn't say it because there's somebody at every corner watching them, but they knew it. And that's what finally led to it was unsustainable, because the amount of effort they have to put into to maintain this machinery sucks more and more people out of the population into the bureaucracy, to the point that nobody's sustaining it, nobody's working, or there's a critical mass where always every communist country reaches, where the productivity goes so low, and there's so many bloated in the government trying to supervise the people that supposedly they're liberating, that it just can't continue. And so the language thing is really their weakness. They think it works, and that's just my argument. No, it doesn't work. They can say till they're blue in the face that so and so is a girl, and I don't care. Even if they coerce me into going along with it, I'll go, no, he's not. No, he's
Well,
not.
as you know, my thing, I'm going after this whole business of marks and mark making, this semiotics of nationalism. And of course, I've been talking about this subject with you longer than just about anyone.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see where it goes. But one of my pieces is that they focus culturally. I mean, one of the major things that I'm going to be talking about at length in this book, and I'm outlining it now, so it is going to happen. Just have to finish this damn Circassian translation. I mean, the translation's done. I'm integrating all the edits that I got from the guy who checked it. That book will go out the door, and bang, I'll be on semiotics.
So long. Imagine translating Circassia. Doesn't everyone?
No, it's Ottoman, but it's a Circassian author.
Translating Ottoman, doesn't every other kind of reading guide know how to do that?
Well, it was also a tiny book, and it took me 10 years, so I'm not going to claim any. Yeah. Anyway, the point is that I'm looking at the way in which they insert themselves in the gap between the signifier and the signified, and this comes down to your point about languaging reality, or just language.
Is Saussurian semiotics. If anybody wants to look into that, Saussure I call semiology, Peirce is semiotics. And then you'll see that relationship that Peirce delineates all the levels in his own model of the relationship between the sign, object, and interpretant. And he shows that they're not the same forces. And I included that in my dissertation, as you saw. And I think I made a contribution to that, I'm not sure, but definitely that you have to have magnitudes of effect, or some way of seeing relative magnitudes. So that's what you're saying. You can't just willy-nilly reassign a sign-object relationship and think it has the same efficacy. It does not.
Indeed, but it can create all kinds of mess, and it can create a kind of stuttering. Right. Like I talked about, it's less important.
Forces behind it. They're not just leaving it up to you. There's social pressure.
That is a massive social pressure. Yeah. And so what's introduced there, as I've said many times, I think it's more important that it's less important what it is that you're uncertain about that causes you to hesitate and reconsider before you speak or act. The most important thing is to get you habituated and accustomed to this idea that you should be introducing a pause between your thought and your speech or your action, because that has a tendency to cut off all kinds of things, which are, for example, instinctive responses.
Right.
And so I believe that there is, to some extent, a correlation between the idea that if you see three black guys on a street and you're the only other person on that street and it's nighttime, and they're coming towards you on the sidewalk, you should cross the street. I think there's a relationship between that and the linguistic thing of, well, what do I call them, right? And if you introduce the hesitation in thought about what I'm thinking and then what I will say, you can even, and we've seen it many times in every damn news thing that we read about where someone, got raped, murdered, and set on fire, there's this whole thing of, well, why didn't you cross the street? Well, I think there's a correlation there between the hesitation.
Williams, if it wasn't a setup, suppose he got fired from NPR for saying pretty much exactly that. He said he was relieved when he turned around and saw a white guy.
Who was that?
Juan Williams, that clown that's on Fox now that I can't stand. He got fired from NPR and went to Fox. I think it was a setup, but whatever. That was the excuse, that he heard these footsteps behind him and he had to admit that when he turned around and saw it was a white guy, he was relieved.
Right. Let's no further comments there. No further comments there, because many come to mind for me. But let's bring it back around to this idea of specifically the aspect of eugenics, because this came up in my discussion. I'm sure some people are thinking it now. Probably there are people who will, you've probably heard people say stuff about it. I know we've talked about it. How do we go about distinguishing eugenics as we're discussing it here, which is indeed a thing that I think we could both say we take issue with, right? We're not for it, right? However, from a broader perspective, it makes perfect sense that, we have this old expression, good breeding, right? I even went and pulled this out because when I was doing my research on signs and stuff, I went through here and I only got like a quarter of the way into the book, and these are all the flags. I just noted, well, I mean, there are a couple of them where I want to check on what word for sign was originally used by the Greeks, semata or whatever. But most of these that you see here are instances of the metaphor being used. Well, let me just give you a couple of examples. Sleeping son of Atreus, tamer of horses, right? The ruler is compared with someone who controls livestock, right? Of some kind. We've got, let me pull another one here. There are just many. Who is that officer? The son of Atreus stands a head taller, but this man appears to have deeper chest and broader shoulders. His gear lies on the ground, but he goes like a bellwether up and down the ranks. A ram, I'd call him, burly and thick with fleece, keeping a flock of silvery sheep in line, right? Endlessly, we see the idea as early as our earliest Greek literature that survives, right? We have the idea of the ruler as someone who is managing a flock or a herd, right? We have them compared to bulls. We have them compared to rams.
What a brilliant insight you said about the fleur de lis.
Well, yeah, that's the idea.
Gold. It's a
right.
gold. Once you see that, you say, no wonder that family lasted so long.
Well, you have to look at the Ancas, as we've talked about, the elephant goad, and then double it, and you can see what the fleur de lis was. I don't think it was a flower. I think that was it. Yeah, a goad, a kentron, a stimulus.
I saw them at the Rocio. Remember that they two ox pull the carreta of the Virgin, and he's got a goad.
Right, and if you get down to Marie-sur-la-Mer, the Jardins, they go out to the sea on horseback, and they've got those prods, right, that are used again for controlling the animals. And so rulership and control of animals is a deeply, deeply embedded metaphor. I mean, I've talked about it before with the crook and the flail.
Leading the flock.
Right, or
we've always done that.
And
so how is that different from what I'm talking about?
Well, last one is the Egyptians, right? The flail to whip them forward, the crook to hook their leg. It's a sign of the pharaoh, of rulership. So as old as time, is the notion that we manage our flocks and herds. And then you carry that over, you've got the idea of cattle, as you know, chattel, right? And capital. All those words go back to this. They're all intertwined semantically. So our currency, our capital, right? We
Bucks.
also say
the bucks.
Bucks, like buckskin. The skin's being used as a unit of but you've also got the idea of that being capitalism is managing, the capital, which is the head count, which is the herd, right? And even among the Romans, you had the capitecensi, right? Those who were just as a head count. They weren't of a place. They weren't known as a name. They weren't.
The Indo-Europeans' capacity for breeding animals, if everything, is astounding. All you have to do is look at the dogs. What we've done with dogs is unbelievable. Have you seen those dogs at work, like sheep herding dogs and all this? It's unbelievable. There's a talent, and for us to think that they weren't thinking the same thing with their fellow humans, of course they were. I mean,
and of course with aristocratic families, as you well know. And the idea is you take it in a particular direction, as I talk about in my clip on the house and household, that as a fundamental social technology, right? And like we both know, I mean, you introduced me to it, seeing how the flamencos will take a child and start to train them at like 4 and 5 and 6.
Oh yeah,
and only when they do it that way, only when they start from childhood, as indeed Mozart's father did with him, right? Only when you start at that level, that deep, do you produce the most powerful product. So we could
go listen to an entire. He went to Venice and heard the entire concerto and went back home and wrote it. What the fuck, man? I mean, sure, he was a genius anyways, but even for a genius, he went back and wrote the whole damn thing that they used to keep in a lock and key so it only came out once a year. There's only one copy of it, so that nobody could ever, and people heard it every year. He went and listened to it and then wrote it out.
So we agree that this is a fundamental aspect of your Indo-European culture, period.
Yes.
We can also agree that it's not just Indo-European culture. In Semitic culture, you get all kinds of stuff about the herdsman and the shepherd. Shamgar killed his enemies with an ox goad. I think that that's a metaphorical aspect of rulership too, but I'm not enough of a biblical scholar, or any kind of a biblical scholar. Anyway, not only is it an Indo-European fundamental metaphor for wealth creation, to have your flocks multiply, and to breed them in particular ways to produce longer wool or whatever it is, right? We also see that with aristocrats, that's a fundamental aspect. We used to call it good breeding, and it's a supreme importance, I believe, for our culture. And I settled upon the idea that the household is the fundamental unit, rightly so, for developing it and doing it, right? And indeed, they would bind the houses and families together to create larger units.
And it's very careful. You don't just breed with anybody. You don't marry anybody.
Right.
You look it over. You look at their family and you go, "Oh, wait a minute. There's a lot of genetic train wrecks in there."
Right. Look at that dwarfish ant.
You may have money, but I don't want my kid to look like you.
Right. Or somebody said in the chat too, the Habsburg chin, right, or the overbite. There are all kinds of things that can arise as a problem. But I guess I want to come back to this main point. Granting everything that we just talked about, how are we to distinguish good breeding, which we can all agree is something we should have and need, right? How do we distinguish that from this idea of eugenics as you're talking about it?
Right. I'm very kind of that way specific. I'm talking about state eugenics, where the state is going to control your breeding, your health care, everything about you cradle to grave, including your genetic makeup. If we had any trust that they would actually improve us, okay, I might say not a bad idea. I don't have any delusion that any such thing will happen like that. If they find a way to dumb down 3/4 of the population that can't even reproduce and into stupidity that they can manipulate and still fleece, they will. So I guess that's what I'm saying. A state eugenics program of global socialism is a monstrosity. And yet I'm eventually going to go to the only way they'll finally hit the wall that says the only way we can truly penetrate this human little beast that we want to control is we're going to have to lobotomize their spirituality. We're going to have to take it out of them. And once that's done, we're not going to have a human being left. That's my opinion.
Well, I mean, based on that fundamental point, the fundamental point you made, if we are indeed homo religiosos, echoes of Mircea Eliade, right? If indeed we are, and I'm of that same school with you.
Like I said, it could go either way.
Right, but according to Nietzsche, it doesn't matter.
Have an experience, and people revere it. They're even scared of it. That you can know your place in the universe, and you organize your society around it. Every single one of them does that.
Right, granting that we agree on that.
So if it's illusional or not, it is the basis. Now, do you want to rip that out? Yeah, go ahead.
Right. And if indeed, and I agree with you, as I just said, that is we are homo religiosos, and I agree. Then, yeah, if you removed that instinct or smothered it, suppressed it, right, or lobotomized it, as it were, you would not have man left. And yet, this is a very interesting point. And I'm going to leave you to expound upon it for just a moment. I'll be right back. But I'll be able to hear you in the meantime. If you could just talk a little bit about the point you raised with me, which is that the elites continue to indulge their own programs of breeding. I myself would point to somebody like a Jared Kushner or a Mark Zuckerberg to underscore the way in which they seem to be breeding towards a type fair-skinned, right?
Right?
Yeah, but being very, very careful about it.
Very.
But could you expand a bit upon this idea that there's a certain kind of
the immigration aspect of it? Absolutely.
Well,
yeah. Is this immigration intended to improve us?
Well,
Right?
yeah.
No, absolutely not. And they know it. That's what's so cynical about it. They know.
As I said, I'm going to go away for 1 second, but before you get to the population aspect, because I think that's something we do need to cover.
It starts with what you just mentioned. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, first talk about how the elites today do not appear to have turned loose of the ancient technology of aristocracy, which is to breed actually for a better type. And I'll be right back.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And the only way we know that is just by watching them. You watch who they're mating with, and who are all the aristocracies in the world. From Arabs and Turks have been doing this forever, and so have even the people of Spain. If you've looked into the history of where the Muslim empires pushed to their extremes, one thing that people started to notice was that their aristocracy started to look more and more Caucasian, and even kind of surprised. Like there's a time where a fellow from Baghdad came to Cordoba in Spain in the kind of the latter years of the I think it was to Granada, but no, it's Cordoba, so it was still middle. I want to say it's probably, they were driven out in 1492. This was probably in the 1300s, and he was shocked at all these blonde, blue-eyed rulers that were Muslim. Well, in those days they would say he took a Christian wife, but that was ethnicity and religion were completely linked. So if he said he took a Christian wife, it meant he married a white woman. This happened and they attributed some of the fall to that. And same thing with the Turks, that they increasingly look more and more like the Europeans. And if you've been to Istanbul, you've seen that. So, and if you look at Arab aristocracies, they'll have a very Arab first wife, and the second wife will be a Scandinavian.
Yeah, and definitely a trend towards a fairer and fairer skin as an aspirational ideal.
Yeah, that's what I say. It was happening there at the push of Islam westward. It happened in Cordoba, and they were commenting on it. And it happened again in the Turks, where they commented on how the Turkish aristocracy was looking more and more. And if you just look at the Turks, drew pictures of each other, so you can see it. Very fair-skinned, red-headed guys. So we look at our here, and there's a certain group of people that is disproportionately represented in this push towards the wonders of a diversity and the wonders of mass immigration. But curiously enough, if you look at their own personal habits, you kind of can't help but come to the conclusion that they're not that interested in the diversity. And if you look at, I brought this up before, I'm trying to find the quote because somebody took it down, but it was between Adorno and Hofstadter, two of the premier people of the scholars, scholars of the Frankfurt School. And by the way, Adorno was basically an ethnomusicologist. He was a musicologist. So it shows you some other day we can do something on the relationship between human music and consciousness, which would explain that ethnomusicology has been around for a long time. And it's a branch of anthropology. At any rate, Adorno, and everybody knows him, majorly quoted fellow, they were talking about mass immigration to Europe before World War II as a deliberate act. And yet they said, but for their particular people, they were going to refrain. And he gave a reason for that. So this has been undergoing for a long time. Now, I think Charles de Gaulle was in on some of this too, as far as with the Arabs. There's Kalergi, who was, he's the guy that, he's got...
Everybody here knows Kalergi.
Right, yeah. Okay, so how influential was he? Well, there's a building in the United Nations named after him. He's the one that chose Beethoven's Ninth to be the theme song. So take it with a grain of salt, very peculiar guy, but he was funded by a certain family. So that is peculiar, right? In other words, yeah, there's something pesky about these Caucasians. We have this crazy idea that individuality is of supreme importance, and we're belligerent enough and smart enough to resist being completely suffocated by any autonomous power. So I'll leave it to you. You, audience, you, anybody. Yeah. My gut reaction is I look at what the aristocrats are doing, and they obviously think that diversity is not that great a thing, but they want us to indulge in it to the point that part of it is also culture. They want to have a population with no sense of history, no sense of identity, no sense of being of anything except what the state gives them. You remember what Biden said to that black fellow? If you don't know who you're going to vote for, then you ain't really black. I mean, that was like a lizard repetition of what he picked up from the universities and from all of his surroundings. I don't know that he really believes it or not. Does it really matter? But that's university. That's a university meme. You are not black unless you're politically black. On NPR, I witnessed this discussion. I listen to NPR so I can get ill, okay? So I'm listening to it, and they're having this discussion with these women of a certain Homos Africanus, and they're talking about, I think there was a faux pas done in a advertisement, and oh my gosh, the poor, how offensive it was. So what was their solution? Well, you see, every board of directors and every corporation of a certain size needs to have a board of directors that is forced to have a certain proportion of diversity by force. And then the lady went on to say, but it can't be just any black. They must be politically correct. She said that right out of her mouth. Well, what should have been a Saturday Night Live moment, she said it with absolute sincerity, and nobody pushed back on it. Nobody said, what do you mean by that?
Well, who would challenge anything on NPR where the whole point is the NPR voice, which causes horripilations to break out on my skin?
Right at the right moment, to make the point. Yeah, they got it down to science. I have to admit that to them. They've got it down. So yeah, so I'm very I'm wary in general that you have a state eugenics program, and in particular, I'm very wary of what they're doing to us. Yes.
Well, let me come at it then from another direction, because this is all very interesting for me, and I want to hear your further thoughts on it. What do we say to the idea that all culture is fundamentally eugenics? Right? Like, I'm beginning, you may or may not remember, I know you watched it, but my last clip on this theme, right? Where I talked about the Stirner stuff and Nietzsche and Marx. For me, it was a big breakthrough to be able to just say, wait a minute, that's the only term I need to understand what's happening here, right? That the rest, and I brought up that old, your old hyena thing, you have to know to go for the matriarch. You have to identify the thing in the darkness and the yipping and the howling, go straight forward and break its back, right?
Right. There's a video. I hope I can find it.
I watched it. It's on an old nature program. Yeah.
The female lionesses have been treed because they were susceptible to this kind of female hysteria, right? When you create enough yakking and noising, they get distracted and they get freaked out. But the lion was not. He just looked right around. It was weird. And the way he kept his head up, and just like a homing, he homed in on her. And then finally you could see that, oh shit, she realized he's coming for me, because at first she didn't even get it.
And that's an aspect that I'm going to cover in
And
my nationalist semiotics, because
it's not speech.
It's not speech. It's not sound. It's fucking chemical. He lifted up his nose, and minute, tiny particles of the actual creature in question entered the snout of the lion, interacted with whatever the lion version of a hypothalamus is, right? And they went straight for it. Forget about the words, right? Mm-hmm. The biology is the communication, which is why in the realm of ethology, they call it chemical communication, right? Scent. Mm-hmm. And as you know, I've relying on some of Roy Harris's insights, it seems indisputable that scent marking in space is a form of writing, right? So that's, as you know, part of everybody else doesn't. So I'm just briefly mentioning it. My project is to show that writing is prior to speech.
Yes. I thought you did a great job with that.
And well, hopefully I will when I eventually
in religion. Like I just saw the other day where she said, I was at that show that pretty well-known philosopher said, when you look into these cultures, what you see is that art and religion are the same thing. You can hardly separate them. And that's because the experience produces there's a product. Express it. It's beyond language. So you start marking for your own memory and hopefully marking to communicate. But the main first marks were for their own self. What did I see? What was that experience? And they start making marks. And
you see that with mnemonics, and there's an idea you can carry over from linguistics. They call it an idiolect, right? It's the idea that it's think of it as like a dialect, but it's entirely yours. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people like to talk about socially constructed reality and language, but they miss the point that some linguists have brought up, which is quite a sensible one, which is that we have our own dialect with ourselves.
And that's the language. It was not to communicate with other creatures, because dogs and all of them communicate just beautifully. It was actually for ourselves first.
Right. And therefore it's fundamentally mnemonic.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the Platonic idea and the Phaedrus that writing and memory are deeply intertwined. And boy, you should have seen the faces of the people when I was doing that. One of my presentations at Leiden University for that whole writing thing. And when I brought up the old Platonic idea that language and writing are deeply writing and memory are deeply intertwined, and just there was the whole shift of kind of like the whole group was like, oh, that outdated Platonic idea that memory is really a fundamental part of it. The memory for oneself to integrate and organize one's own personal experiences is fundamental. But let me come back.
Idiots were talking about postmodernism, though. They think you were that clown Plato. You fucking monkeys.
So the next point, what I was trying to get at there is, for me, being able to say, wait a minute, all of it's eugenics, right? All this stuff, they're not globalists, they're not technocrats. The fundamental project, everything else is an epiphenomenon, an accident, a secondary thing, right? The fundamental drive is eugenics. Well, here's what I want to ask you. It seems increasingly to me as though saying socialism is eugenics is an unnecessary and perhaps restrictive compartmentalization. I don't know it to be the case, but I want to put it in front of you and hear your response. Why are we not saying everything is eugenics, short of the transcendental realm? And even in the transcendental realm, you want to produce believers who meet their ethical code, who conduct themselves in their lives in a particular way, including mate selection and child rearing that yields a particular thing. So
self-directed evolution, absolutely. But the reason is you can say everything is eugenics, and you can, that's a concept that has to have a lot of truth. But I'm really saying socialism is eugenics rather than eugenics is everything. Because once you understand socialism from that point of view, it opens up your understanding of socialism, that it is really only eugenics with none of the virtues of a direction of like what you were talking about. They want to produce a better human being. They want the power to completely subdue the human cattle. And so they're going to breed it into submission. And so I don't, so in that sense, a state eugenics is monstrous, whereas the eugenics that humans do naturally is a good thing.
Well, so okay, here's a point. Like the Code of Manu that Nietzsche goes on about, right, and how brutal it was, and how it was necessary to tame, right? That's one of the things I liked about Nietzsche. He's always talking about taming, and as I just
behind the oath.
Yes, and the weight of it, the pain of it over the centuries to inculcate it in a culture, to tame and civilize them, right? And that's one of the reasons why I like in here in the early stuff in the Iliad, you know, one of the main epithets, I just reviewed it before we had this stream. I was going back through it and I'm like, wow, there is the rams with the sheep, there is the bull with the cattle, right? But they talk often about the Trojans, but not only tamer of horses, breaker of horses, right? The taming, which and there's a whole period from the mid-century Germans where they talked about a parallel between domestic, you know, you're aware of this, but for our viewers, domestication is considered a parallel with civilization. And so the problems that you get with a domesticated animal, right? Like you take a wolf and you turn it into a dog, right? And what do you get? You get some clear white blazes that begin to appear on the coats, right? And apparently among animal breeders, this is a well-known fact, right? You'll begin to get splotches, right? Or on a horse, you'll get a blaze on the forehead, these bright markings, right? You'll also tend, and it makes sense because those things in a natural environment would stand out and screw with the camouflage, make it easier to see. Although that's not entirely consistent. You know, if I hear a noise in the brush, as I did just a couple of days ago in my house, you know, I might not see the deer, but I'll generally catch I'll see a retreating view of its white ass as it disappears, right? But the point is that with domestication and with civilization, you see that they have similar results. So, you know, when it comes to breeding, one of the big things is ritual behavior that precedes sort of acceptance of the other one as a proper mate, right? So among wild animals, and I've talked about this before on my channel, they will go with with wild animals, they will have incredibly complex rituals that must be performed in a particular way, to where they'll even dance or move their neck in a particular way, right? Or flutter their wings and raise them and display colors, or even spiders that will lift up their limbs to display a weird panoply of color, right? And only if they fully satisfy this set of requirements do they say, we're a mesh, boom, and we come together. And I've suffered in my own life, as I'm sure you have and many viewers have.
Wasn't quite a mesh.
It wasn't quite a mesh. And in fact, chewed up all the gears. This magical love that I thought was going to happen. It's like in Voltaire, you know, where he tries to kisses Cunigund, you know, and afterwards, you know, this story, you know, he has to run the gauntlet with Cunigund's father's men, and he gets whipped with ramrods and punched and kicked to the ground. And afterwards he says, what is this thing called love, for which I've received one kiss and, you know, 100 kicks in the ass? So among us, we see how there is this ritual aspect of mating, and the more wild of us, the more uncivilized of us, will tend to be a little bit more uncompromising. I mean, I've had my sluttish moments too. I will not deny that, right? But it was always in the search for this fit, you know? Whereas, pardon?
Spreading the seed.
Well,
if you think the world deserves it, then, you know, don't hold back.
Then there is the,
you know,
then there is, from the other direction, what happens with animals, continuing this parallel between civilization and domestication. The domesticated animals have much lower standards for their breeding, right? So if the animals are in rut, you know, or in heat or whatever,
throw anything in the pen and
put them in the pen together, and there's gonna be some fucking, right? Yeah. Reminds me of that old joke. Come on to my party. There's gonna be fucking, and there's gonna be fighting, and there's gonna be drinking. He's like, well, who's gonna be there? So me and you. So anyway, sorry. So the point is that the domestication appears to, well, I mean, it requires a protector. I mean, so think about the deal we made with the animals, right? The cows, they give us milk, they get slaughtered here and there when necessary. But in exchange, they're protected by the shepherd. They're protected by the cattleman, right, from other predators.
And even breeds a dog to protect them.
Right. And then those dogs, in turn, though they wouldn't do so well in the wild, they do well with man, right?
Yeah.
So there's a loss of independence that comes with domestication. We can also talk about, you could carry it over to socialist theories about production, social production, right? How many people today produce everything that they need for themselves? We don't. No one does anymore. It's socially produced, right? So we can end up with supply chain problems and logistics issues like we suffer from.
Pointed out, though, in any group of people, that the actual producers are a pretty limited number.
Right. It's probably less than a Pareto distribution, right? But the point I'm getting at here is that perhaps we see some parallel with what they're doing with their eugenics program, because a domesticated creature is no longer fit to live in the wild and requires the herdsman.
I see where you're going, and they, in their own minds, they may be rationalizing it, but the answer is no. We have to resist it completely.
Well, I mean, take a look at the hypersocialization of the Scandinavians, right? And the way in which they're, at least arguably, shaped by their climate and their environment to rely upon each other very closely. You know, all the R versus K selections.
Oh, they're very big on. I mean, they were one of the last people to stop their eugenics program. They went into the 70s.
Yeah, but also they're the ones who are so terrified.
They're suicidal now.
They're so terrified of stepping outside of line. They're so thoroughly civilized.
Yeah, but you know, I see what you're saying, and I get despondent about the whole idea of self-determination and democracy too. The only excuse that I can come up with, otherwise I become an aristocratic monarchist, sorry, is that when you've been in these school systems your whole life, and then you get the coup de grace at the university level, you can almost understand that, you know, it took a lot. It took a lot of just banging that brain and making them feel afraid to talk back, to resist, to get them to that state. At least I want to rationalize it that way, because otherwise I do start asking myself, shit, man, if you can get half the country to be this stupid. Yeah,
this is my terror about
really, because it's inexplicable. You know, we saw that with the coup. By now, most people should realize, okay, there's something wrong with this. There's something wrong. Come on. And I still talk to people that don't. These are educated people. In fact, they're the worst. And that's part of my, believe it or not, it gives me a little bit of optimism to know that it's the educated that are the worst. And so I say, okay, we can cut humanity some slack. If you get that from childhood, and here you are at university, no wonder you're a bumbling idiot. So we have to tear down the education system. But I still have my moments where I go, even so, how did they manage to get half?
Right? It's the terror that the blank slate people might be right.
Well,
now
to enough degree that they could actually start manipulating, though. But they know that they won't be. See, they got to get rid of us. And that's why I'm saying, does democracy work? I'm not saying no, we will resist. And we have to have our eyes open to realize that our first fight is going to be with our own. That 50% that's been completely snookered, it's a shame, but that's going to be the first step. Because, well, you could argue it could be something else, but it's going to be inevitable. That's why my goal in my whole channel is to try to bring liberals over. I'm not doing a great job because I insult them so much, but I am. That is actually why I founded the channel. Like people like me, I love music, art, Burning Man, poetry. The university should have been my natural home, and instead it's just an abomination.
Oh, I was there for part of it when you were having to jump through the final hoops of fire, and the degree to which PhD programs, we don't have to go way into this, but just as a brief aside, the degree to which PhD programs appear to be an exquisite form of torture is really appalling.
And conditioning. They wanted me to contribute to the field, and they wanted 125 double-spaced 12-point. No, they didn't want me to contribute to the field. They wanted me to regurgitate the party line. How the hell could you contribute to a field that's been around for a century and a half, in a little document that's not that much bigger than a college than a high school term paper.
Yeah, try doing a Twitter appeal with like,
Right.
30 characters. Yeah.
Well, I said to them, well, if you think you can write it in that, you write it. And that didn't endear me to them either, but
Yeah.
I did have some champions though. Remember good old Bulldog Stewart and Carolina Robertson, who used to be a communist in her youth. I got to hand it to them. There were still some good people.
Well, let's go. So, I don't want to totally leave this. So let's just ask one quick question before we jump to another observation, at least. Is it possible that in our own way, we, and not as a result of the recent innovations, right? The recent innovations in manipulation of populations, not even as a result of the French Revolution, not as a result of post-World War II boomer truth regime, not even as a result of 1964 and the various changes.
Yeah.
Going back all the way to things Nietzsche talks about, how we painfully and over centuries and necessarily brutally civilized ourselves. If we take that previous view that civilization and domestication operate in parallel, or that they can be seen as metaphorically dimensionalizing each other, right? Is it possible that, not as a result of socialist nonsense, just our own culture and history, that we've over civilized ourselves? Again, the Scandinavians come to mind.
Yeah, but see,
the Germans come to mind.
All our people have been aware of that, right? That's that cycle of, strong men produce easy times produce weak men produce hard times. All of them knew that. They all talk about the dangers of degeneration of any house. And that's why a lot of them would just wait for that house to get weak enough. But see, there's all the checks and balances at work in these sophisticated class societies that keeps the whole race from going down the hill, right? It'll just be a family that degenerates. It'll be that section that degenerates. And they've always been very aware of that. Like when a family bloodline is just spent, it's not going to go anywhere. But when you're breeding for the strongest, most cunning males, and yeah, we started that a long time ago. I know this is kind of a silly book to some people, but it was pretty good. The Myths of Avalon, with that quote, what of the old stag when the new stag comes to fruit or whatever.
That's Ursula Le Guin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you should look into the heavy money and socialist promotion, and yeah, there's some. But go on.
Yeah, so the idea was that our ancestors, you would, in a matriarchy, if it's, I don't believe any such thing ever existed, but you would fight your way for the right to have sex with the queen or her consorts, and of course the witches would keep track of the bloodlines, and they knew, right? They knew who the father was because they kept track of all that. This was very careful breeding. You bred for a more cunning, more robust, stronger, vicious male, knowing though that he has to be contained. So
right. So breed a male to take a woman powerfully and make her his. However, ensure that he does it face-to-face missionary style rather than doggy style, so that you can prove he's
not, and that's. Well, yeah. See, and there's that play between the two has always been there, and everybody's been aware of it. It's not anything new.
Right. Kill your enemies, but protect your woman. Kill your enemies, but protect your woman with your life.
Exactly. And we could go on about the white liberal male. He's a eunuch because he doesn't do the fundamental first thing of any male. Hold your ground, you fucking pussy. Just if you don't do anything else, do that. Hopefully protect the woman and hold your ground. And there's nothing a eunuch hates more than the sight of a man walking by proudly showing off his balls, right? It just infuriates them. And then you see that on Facebook, right? They start frothing at the mouth because you're saying, no, I won't go along with this. No, it's a lie, and you're a fool for believing it. And they just come at you like piranha. Yes, we've always known this, but this level, I don't know if you've heard this, like if you have a house floating, it's a large house, right? Well, what if it's the size, of an island? Is it still a house? Well, it's still a house. Okay, what if it's floating in outer space now and it's the size of a planet? Do you still call it a house? In other words, magnitude changes quality. So
wasn't it the commies who said, one of the commies, was it Lenin or Stalin? Maybe, I can't remember. Somebody said quantity has a quality of its own, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so, yes, everything is eugenics. We've always been doing this. Absolutely. But when you have a global state doing it in order to produce a more docile population, we just have to say no, and furiously. And now what I'm trying to bring with, especially with the next video, is people, it's accelerated. It's in your high schools now. If you doubted when I said, well, Planned Parenthood and abortion was just a Trojan horse to get them into the government. Okay, you don't go along with that, fine. But now Planned Parenthood is in your high school, and behind your back, they're cutting off your kid's testicles and suggesting that he's a girl and going along with it. And it's against the law to actually talk to him like you would, that, well, maybe you just got a problem, No, this is way beyond that. And now it's accelerating. And that's the purpose of this series of Useless Eaters, is to, in my own way, just try to alert people that this is different than our ancestors breeding each other for strength and for virility. And yes, and also a certain amount of domestication, a gentleman as opposed to a warrior. I never liked that. A soldier versus a warrior. The soldier turns around and runs. They shoot him in the back. The warrior, like Achilles, goes, "Nah, Agamemnon, you mess with this slave of mine, I'm not going to fight tomorrow. Fuck you." He could. Agamemnon couldn't say, "Shoot him, kill him." You won't do that to Achilles. Nobody can. And he told Agamemnon to his face, "I'm not going to fight. Fuck you."
Yeah, but then and this could
do that, right?
This could be I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but it seems useful, at least conversationally, to push back and say how well, for example, when Hannibal was crossing the Alps, right? I often talk about this little story. It's related, I think, in Livy, or what Livy survives regarding Hannibal. Hannibal's coming through with the elephants, and he's crossing the Alps to get into northern Italy, and he gets stopped in this pass by a bunch of Celts, right? And they basically have him dead to rights. He's blocked on steep ground at the worst possible place. The adage for warriors that you should fight in a doorway, right? And so they had the perfect ground, and Hannibal was fucked. And yet what happened? The Celts got up there and started to brag about their bloodlines, and one after another would get up on the rock and say, "I'm the son of the son of the son of, and I will destroy your men," and began to boast and recite some poetry and all these wonderful things that we love. And Hannibal just stole a march around them, came at them from behind while they delayed and crushed them. Or take a look at how
I agree. The soldiers win.
Right. And see, that's
I know. But nonetheless, I don't like the soldier, but I have to admit they win.
But what does that mean culturally? If there's that much of there's a divergence between our native aesthetics and reality. How horrifying is that? That's another one of these calls where you're like, what if they're true, and what if they're right about it, and it is a tabula rasa, and man can be made into anything, and anyway a mass-produced soldier is, I don't know, because you get into the idea of command.
I agree, and I lament the, and you can see it with, remember the battle, you probably know this one, where they were fighting the Turks. It'll come, probably won't come to me, but the French insisted that, no, you're not going to steal the
I know which one. We were reading.
We're going to go to the front line. No, we're going to attack. And yeah, man, they were glorious. Yeah, they were winning. And at the last moment, the Turks are really good at that. They'll snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. Well, no, we do that. Snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. They turn it around, and they won. And they won precisely because these crazy Frenchmen just insisted on glory, and they went headlong into the battle, and they looked beautiful and splendid, and they did a splendid job until they got surrounded, and they were so far ahead of the other guys, they couldn't get to them in time, and lost the whole battle. I know. Whereas the Janissaries, strategic, behaved, kept in line. I know.
The only way I can write that off is to say, in the same way that utopianism is nonsense, and that human failings will always be there. I'm not a Christian, but I totally hold with the fundamental notion that we are, quote unquote, fallen, right? Metaphorically speaking, there's always going to be problems. We are here in manifestation. There are always going to be issues. Nothing will ever be perfect. So maybe we can write off this aspect about soldiers defeating true warriors in two ways. One is to bear in mind that nothing's ever going to be perfect. And so manifestation has rules of its own. coming down to that observation by whatever the commie it was, quantity has a quality of its own, which I really should now explore and unpack further, because that statement really, if you pair it with the measurable, should not be confused for the real. And yet, if you say quantity has a quality of its own, you move from quantitas to qualitas. Anyway, something interesting there. I'm not sure what it is, but maybe there are two ways for me to come to terms with that. One is that we're in a fallen state, and so to a certain extent, there are going to be ugly truths like that.
Yeah, there's no easy solution to this. But
wait, last one. Last part is, we cannot leave aside the idea of the commander, the leader who embodies these aspects and therefore moves the parts on the battlefield based upon that initiative and personal ability and the rest. So maybe that's a way that we can sort of rescue the Western ideal there. But I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, and after all, we lost that battle, but we did win a few glorious ones. And in the end, they never did take Western Europe. Again, the whole point that I'm doing with the useless eaters is to point out that we're in the midst of being an accelerated eugenics program, and they're going after the children. And we're going to have to do something about that. Exactly what? Well, we'll see. But at least that people become aware that this is strategic, this is deliberate. And if you're fine with it, if you're a communist and say, yeah, we need to breed these bastards into a submission. Yeah, we need to do this. We need less masculine males. Okay, well, then you're with it. But for those people that to read about this, I'm hoping a lot of them will go, holy shit, is he right? And then they'll look into it. That's what I'm hoping for. I don't know that that's going to happen.
Yeah, I proclaimed quite a bit on Twitter and then got shut down over there. They're not for this specifically. I just say it over and over again. They're cutting off women's tits! At what point do you wake up? Like, do you wake up at the cutting off the tits part?
Because a child, look, when I lived in Venezuela, there was a girl across the street from us, and her favorite thing to do was to play horse. Like she was a horse. And she was teaching us how, well, this is how you gallop, this is how you trot. And she had all these collections, and she thought she was a horse. I'm sure she really wanted to be a horse. I can imagine some person, a therapist or whatever in her school going, Janie, do you really feel like you're a horse? Well, maybe you are a horse. And pretty soon, because when I am a horse. No, she could do all that. She could whinny, she could snort. And I'm sure if we were to go see her now, she doesn't walk around thinking she's a horse. But could you imagine if they got her at that age and convinced, yeah, you are a horse, actually. Maybe we need to do some, with species affirmative therapy. Species affirmative, what's it? Gender affirming. It's not just therapy, gender affirming therapy. Yeah, I guess it is.
Care. They also like.
Yeah. They don't put the word chemically in there, but that's what it is.
Right.
And so imagine species affirming therapy. You deep down inside, honey, you are a horse.
Okay, little colts, get ready. We're handing out the feed bags.
Yeah.
How do you feel about oats?
How insane is that? You're going to let a child, even a 16-year-old, tell you, no, I'm actually a girl. I need to have this cut off. And then they're seeing that the rate of regret and stuff is insane. The first two twins that the guy did that experiment with, both of them ended up committing suicide. He did it to one, not the other. It's an abysmal story from beginning to end. So you wonder, why is the state getting involved in this? Why is Pelosi making laws against the alternative? What's it doing in our schools? So that's my part. All I can do is bring it out, push it out there, and hopefully people who, for a tiny little reach, whoever does see it might get appalled, might put it in front of the right people. And that's all I can hope for. So yes, I agree that eugenics itself, that's what we do. But this is abominable.
Right. And we're not universalists. So obviously, or I'm not. And so obviously there will be places where this thing is right in its application and other places where it's wrong. Right. There are particular circumstances for everything that we have to consider. And that's the part that I think most of the slobberers and mouth breathers get hung up on, right? They're looking for the simpler rule that they can hold up like a lantern in front of themselves and always use it as guidance. Yeah. And the reality is, anybody with any years under their belt comes to understand is that you have to judge each case. Mm-hmm. It's different, right?
Plus they're afraid. They're afraid of going against it. They've succeeded in doing this to the population. they're afraid of saying, even if their conscience is going, man, this sounds really grotesque.
Because that hesitation has been introduced.
Yeah, exactly. You call them a transphobe, and that's it. They don't have any friends.
Yeah. Well, let's step away from that. One thing I want to observe is that, if you think about the idea of a race as a category, all the way down to its constituent ethnic groups, which I do not disavow, right? Of course, there are separate ethnic groups, and the idea of a race, whether you're talking about blacks or whites, is strictly limited in many respects, right? Because the difference between a Ukrainian Galician and a Galician from Spain, right, is or Portugal is all of them being that Atlantic coast. It's enormous, right? So I'm not saying that race is entirely accurate, right? However, what I'm getting at here is that the very terminology that they seek to impose upon us signals the eugenics program such as it is, right? We're not allowed to say race exists.
Right, but they're busy underlining it.
Well,
or something they think doesn't exist, they're awfully busy.
Eager to get rid of some of it, right? But it shows, granting and leaving always as acknowledged, that much of their mumbling is, when you really get down to it, is addle-pated, inconsistent slobbering, right? However,
they're consistent in moving us towards a global fascist state. They're very deliberate. It's going very well according to plan.
But the point I want to raise,
they're inconsistent because they're absurd. But the fact that they got people to believe it, that's the kind of
right. And the arguments always shift in order to reach the end, which remains consistent
to the arguments.
But what I want to point out is that there is, with race, you have the idea of a cultural mandate, right? If you talk about racial groups and ethnic groups, then there is the idea that there are different ways that could be right for each one of them, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as you introduce the idea of individuals as a universal mandate, then that is the ultimate salve, right? That allows them to coagulate it elsewhere. So if we look at the framing of race not existing, only individuals existing, and those individuals always already being fungible, replaceable, right? Just bring them to the magic soil and they'll transform into whatever flavor of the week is most acceptable. That whole framing is itself a eugenic framing that disallows certain discussions and focuses certain others. Is it not?
Yeah, it is. The only thing is, I wouldn't want to be just, even if they're not right. So therefore, that's not really eugenics. That's kind of insanity. I would simple thing. You put 50 of one persuasion over here, the Caucasoid, and you put 50,000 over here, and you leave them alone, and you come back 20 years later, and those cultures will not look the same. They will not. And we're seeing that right before our eyes. We've been around each other long enough. And you just got to move from one part of a town to another and realize, no, it feels different. It's different. And so the idea that we're interchangeable and replaceable, like when the medical people were saying, oh, the difference between the DNA of this people and that people is so ridiculously small it doesn't matter. No, wait a minute. Those little DNA differences, it's like an angle. Down here, it's tiny. Out there in the manifestation, it can be huge.
Right. It's just like a sight picture on a rifle. You're off this much here, but 200 yards down range.
Exactly. And so when you look at the differences, well, there's not that much difference between us and a dog, for that matter, or us and an ape. But those little differences, that is the difference. And what they can't say is we're not genetically different, because we obviously are. All you got to do is put two of those over there, and they get two of those. And if you put two of those over there, you get two of those. And you don't get, this kid doesn't come out of that womb, and this kid won't come out of that womb, no matter how many times you do it. So the genetic reality is there. How much difference does that make? Okay, well, you can argue about that, but Europe doesn't look like another continent, does it? And they've had 200 years, 300, you can go on and upset as many people as you like. anybody that goes from one place to another goes, shit, those places are really different. Okay, they're different. You say the genetic difference is teeny, makes no difference? Really? Go to that culture and then go to this culture. And then you tell me if it's a small difference. And now you can go to London, and all I got to do is just go to another part of London. And then you tell me if it's different.
Right.
It's massively different. It's so different that the rulers now have to shut you up from talking about it because it's so in your face different. They have to force you to shut up, which means they know it's different. They know it's really different. And they can't afford it to get out, blatant into the media. So it's totally suppressed. Now, I don't know if you've been following. There's been a lot of riots and killings in London, small scale riots. You never hear about it. It's very deliberate. They're going on right now.
Yeah, there's no shortage of examples of that sort of thing happening all across what they like to call the West, right?
Yeah.
Everywhere. A few things. I have one sort of final question that I want to make sure that we address as a discussion point. And then I was going to open up the floor for questions from people with some of our remaining time. But before doing that, I know that you laid out a number of things that you wanted to cover while we talked. And I want to make sure that anything else that you wanted to bring up or discuss, we have some room for that as well. So is there anything that you wanted to cover here?
I think we hit all the major points as leading up to my next one. And it's very, and the one after that, there's going to be a couple. I'm also doing something that's called female genitalia, not female genital mutilation, but female, it's called sex selection, where female fetuses are deliberately chosen for abortion because they're female. I'm going to do something on that. It's kind of an aside. It really just shows how the feminists can, the way the feminists have been throwing women under the bus is unbelievable. And we're seeing it now with the transgender, where they're just throwing women under the bus. But I'm going to show how even 30 years ago it was going on. It was absolutely vicious. But other than that, it's the fact that this eugenics program, I'm arguing, is now gone into acceleration. It's in another gear now. It's going into our schools, and it's in another gear.
And where do you think it's going? Just so we make sure we cover that. What is the end state? What is the target?
We can only guess. And my first impulse is they're going to make a more effeminate male, a weaker people.
I have to kind of laugh. They're gonna.
Oh, they've already done a splendid job, yes, but it can get worse. And so I can't say. All I know is that I don't want it done, and that the people doing it I despise, and I'm certain that whatever they're up to, I don't want. And so, it's going to be, well, we're not supposed to go too far that direction, so we won't. But something's gonna have to hit the fan.
Yeah, hopefully there's something rather than our something. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Well, then here's what I'm going to do, if it's all right with you. I'm going to bring up this last point and get your thoughts on it. And then I'm going to, while doing that, I want to encourage people in the background. If you have questions for myself or Gerard, Jolly Scholar 888, please do check out his channel. If you have questions for either of us, put an @Semiagog in the chat so that it'll be highlighted for me and I can see it. And while we talk about what we're going to talk about now, it will give you guys time to front load some questions. And as soon as we finish discussing this part, we'll turn to those questions and, answer them as is appropriate, if they're addressed to me or to Gerard. Is that okay with you, G?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Okay, well then, like I said, get your questions in there with an @Semiagog so that I can find them easily. And I'm going to ask this last question, and this is something I brought up in my my last video, the one on socialism is eugenics, and that is, what do you think is going on with this whole business of focusing on saving the world? Because the people who are the most eugenic, the people who are the most vociferous in attempting to foist their putative eugenics upon us are the ones also most eager to talk about saving the world and all the changes we must make to save the world. And, when I talked in my last video about it, I was like, well, are we looking at a microcosm, macrocosm thing here where the idea of what we do with the individual is also reflected more broadly? You go all the way back to Plato's Republic, and you have the idea that the state itself is a reflection of the constitution of an individual person with its virtues and vices and, justice and the rest. So there is this sort of fundamental macrocosm, microcosm. And then I thought to myself, well, maybe it's just having to do with projection, right? Like we won't face the fact that we want to make these changes within ourselves. So we push it out here in the broader world. I wanted to ask about that. My own take is that, really all the thing about Mother Nature is a kind of new flattened materialist religion. And so basically staying within the constraints of materialism, they just want to talk about another way of saving the world. In this case, it's not to usher in salvation or judgment or the heavenly Jerusalem or whatever it is, right? In this case, it's just pretty straightforward. Let's give ourselves something bigger that we must all work on together. I bring this up because, again, the eugenics and the climate, the supposed climate agenda,
yeah,
they're deeply intertwined. And I went thinking about it many times, trying to figure out what was going on with this idea of, Mother Nature and this new religion. I went back and forth with the microcosm, macrocosm. And now at this point, it just seems to me that it's just smoke and mirrors, nothing more. I mean, I've talked about it before. Doubtless you're aware of it. Doubtless many people viewing this have thought about it. If you say that there's a global problem and that we must all integrate our behavior in order to address it, then you're going to need global mechanisms to make that happen, which end up being, at a minimum, global regulatory bodies. And as we know, they get the thin end of the wedge in, and then it becomes global government, right? So to me, it seems that these things are likely paired simply because, practically speaking, it's an easy way for them to justify ever more centripetal, centripetal accumulation of power at the center. And at the same time, it gives you a distracting justification for everything that you're doing, because we can't forget that everything that we're supposed to do to change the world really comes down to how we all live and what we all are allowed and not allowed to do. So I just wanted to ask you about this thought. What do you make of it?
Particular, it's being used to domesticate us. Yeah, I see it as it's the Christian messianic impulse without Christianity. They've lobotomized Christianity. They did that sometime starting in the 30s and 40s. When I look at, and people here may disagree with me, but when I did that series on the Great Awakenings, which I have not completed, one of the things I was trying to say is that every good thing, in my opinion, that's happened in America, and there have been some very good things, every wave was precipitated, every focus of change, from the revolution to the Civil War to the civil rights to women's empowerment, was pushed by what we call these Great Awakenings, these spiritual movements that people felt compelled to go into the forest, the camp meetings, and they would get in the spirit, and you can make fun of them, or they'd sit in their places and shake, and we get shakers. But I did a pretty good job, I think, of showing that every major university of on the East Coast, especially, all of them were started by these movements. Harvard was started by the Puritans. So what we have is that every positive change that's happened in America, maybe the Civil War was a bloody mess, maybe it could have been averted or whatever, but we did end slavery here and throughout the world. It didn't just stop here. So if we go from the American Revolution onward, it's been pushed by these Great Awakenings, that spiritual entity within us, for better, for worse. Okay, I'm saying it was good. I'm saying it was good. And now we're pushing now a very similar impulse, but it's no longer guided by Christian ethics in the deepest sense and the religious experience. They've simply Like when they got a hold of the civil rights movement, they've turned it into the catastrophe that it is now. Many people say that before the 60s, Black people were actually better off, that their neighborhoods were never this bad. I don't want to argue that. I don't know. I'm not Black. I don't really, but whatever. It's certainly, there's a big argument to say that once the secularists, once the universities, the socialists got a hold of the civil rights movement and turned it into Black Lives Matter, it's a catastrophe. It's done nothing for Black people, including Obama did nothing for Black people. Trump did more for Black people. So if that's a concern to you, what I'm saying is that the civil rights movement was guided by the third, fourth Great Awakening. That's what galvanized it. Once it was appropriated by the secular socialists, it's become a catastrophe for Black people. And I say that with all of these movements. They're the messianic impulse, completely devoid of Christian content. And whether you hate or love Christianity, one thing you can't do is separate Western civilization from Christianity. I mean, you can't. Are we moving towards that? Okay, it's one of the reasons I go to Burning Man and I say, wow, that's very curious that they're reinventing, right? I don't even go much into it, but what brought me to Burning Man was the temple. As an instinct, the temple has become the dominant, most important part to many of the burners, but it didn't start off that way. It was nothing but an incidental, but here they are, people recreating, people having experiences. And I went there and saw it for myself. I thought it was very profound. I mean, yeah, for all Burning Man can be silly and ridiculous, there's a lot of parts of it that are pretty impressive. And that temple that is now the heart and soul of Burning Man just shows you how this impulse is non-stoppable. And the hippies actually went underground. They never totally got appropriated by the socialists in the universities. And they were there. The festival culture has been going on the whole time. Now people can poo-poo it. They think, all right. But again, all of the great things that happen in America happen, as I'm seeing it, pushed by the Great Awakenings. Now we're being pushed by total secular, and we might even, some people say it. I refrain from going that far, but it's almost demonic. And frankly, when I see what's going on in a high school, like in California, and that they're actually going to talk these kids into cutting off their dicks and cutting off their tits, and they're going to shoot them up with drugs, man, if that's not demonic, I don't know.
Yeah.
Good argument for it, isn't it? It's a damn good argument for it.
Right. That's definitely one of our suspects for demonic activity, right? Now I don't want to get too far into this, but it's interesting to me, and I don't see a whole ton of questions at this point. So I will go back and hit the questions. But I just want to ask you about this because, Academic Agent, I'm sort of part of that crew. No express, no endorsement on their part of me, expressed or implied, but I'm sort of a part of their crew, and I certainly enjoy listening to Academic Agent's takes. Less so when he just endlessly just derides and dismisses and expresses his disgust for America and Americans. But he's half Iranian, so some of that great Satan survives in him, and there is certainly an argument to be made that Americans have been on the front line of fucking things up for a while now.
Yeah.
Not just for Iran, for Western Europe and we're the main, as I see it from my view, we are the group now that has been taken over and used via our elites, right, to promote a certain agenda.
The Ukraine war, we did that.
Right. But what happens here is that Academic Agent will come in and say, it's not just that you were taken over, it's fundamental to America and what the American experiment is that has brought us all these ills and all these problems. But wait now, hang on, let me get this out and you'll have full room. I'd love it if you could effectively refute it, right? But the more I listen to the very interesting stuff that you bring up about the Great Awakenings, which I'd never paid attention to, right? Like some of my friends over on AA's side, I'm sure know a lot about this. Somebody like Turnip or probably like Radlib, some of those guys, they probably know quite a bit about the Great Awakenings that I don't, right? But like in your last video where you start talking about, for example, how the women's suffragettes and this kind of thing, and women's empowerment kind of people, as we would talk about it today, were bombing places in the 19th century, right?
Late 1800s, early 1900s. Yeah.
Well, it's that just starts to make me go, right? But the more I listen to you talk about the Great Awakenings, And the more I listen to you talk about the way in which they affected the United States and the general direction culturally, and the way in which all these different things, penal reform, not penile, penal reform, women's suffrage, temperance movements, all these things.
The American Revolution.
Well, maybe we do have to go back that far. To me, the American Revolution
was right before the Revolution, and I contend that it set the emotional stage for why we had one. The emotional intellect.
Well, then explain to me what is good about the various Great Awakenings.
Well, if you hate Christianity,
well, wait. There's something first you have to do. And even I don't understand this well. I'm sorry to cut you off, but you really have to do this or nobody will get it. Can you summarize what the hell these are for people who've never even heard of them, and then make your point?
Yeah, it's basically grassroots movements that people began to go into. The idea was that you had to experience the Holy Spirit, that taking dogma was not good enough. And so average people, they had the learned elites in the early colonies. They were called the congregational churches. And you had to, in order to preach, you had to be appropriate. You had to have gone to the school. And what happens, you had all these people that they were saying, no, he may be learned in letters, but he doesn't have the Spirit. And we don't
it's fundamentally Protestant.
Oh yeah, this is all Protestant. And so they would go into these camp meetings. They would go into the forest, as I call it, into the forest. Like you said,
literally into the forest.
Literally, and stay there for 3 or 4 days. And what he called with a Dionysian was the encounter of the paradox that lies at the heart of existence. And they would have these feelings and these great experiences. And yes, were the charlatans and whatnot? Of course, there were. There's everywhere. But one of the things that when they came to the conclusion was, we don't need the Church of England. We can direct experience our relationship with the divine. We don't need the Church of England.
And wait, I want to stick something in there because Yiz is saying that, she doesn't believe that these were actually grassroots movements. Yiz, go and find, what's her name? Frances Trollope's book on the Americans. And she came in the 1830s. And she describes one of these revivals she went to in the forest. Trust me, these were not top-down impositions. They were absolutely grassroots.
That's an argument you really can't make, because the top people were actually against it, but slowly they got won over. They started they allowed women to speak. They allowed Black people to speak.
Even at events with whites, where one of them that Trollope talks about, you have white preachers over on one side, but as a part with their own distinct little area, right? But as a part of the same major movement, you had Blacks preaching.
Oh, but you had them in the same ones. On the same stage, a Black person would come up and speak too, or a woman would come up and speak, and none of them had degrees. So that's a hard argument to make, that this was somehow contrived top down. That's a very hard argument to make, but okay. If she thinks that, I'm saying no, it wasn't. It definitely was a grassroots. Sorry, that's the thing to give Mom her pills.
Do you need to go?
No. I'm sure that Diana's done that. So
okay, so coming back to what's good about them.
Well, in this case, for instance, the fundamental principle is that one of the fundamental principles of Christianity is that we have an immortal soul, and that immortal soul, your decisions in this little puny lifetime determines the outcome for eternity. So you have a hand in determining eternity. All right, it's absurd, I know, and a lot of people think it's absurd. Nonetheless, that belief made people, it forced them to make dramatic decisions in their lives. What you're doing will affect your soul for eternity. And one of the things that the earlier aristocrats in the medieval ages had to come, it was called the peace of God, where they were forced to, okay, you can beat up your serfs, you can do this and that. But what you cannot do is you cannot impede the pilgrim's progress to heaven. There must be churches, there must be the priests. You must make sure that they go to communion, confession, they're educated in the faith. You must do that. Well, that was done here for the Black people with the same argument. That, okay, yeah, they may be slaves, but they still have an eternal soul. They still have to be educated, blah, blah, blah. And this is before the American Civil War, mind you. I mean, yeah, before the Revolution, they were actually, Black people were speaking, women were speaking, and arousing the people. And one of the things that they came to the conclusion was that they're better off with their individual relationship with the Spirit than taking the direction solely from the educated pastors of the congregational churches.
So let me jump in to anticipate a point.
Church of England.
Right. And let me anticipate a point you're going to make. Because your focus is on the generation of culture from the individual mystical experience, and that is the fundamental seed from which culture grows, and it can never be top down. From your perspective, because it was driven by these individual experiences, it's therefore got its finger on the touchstone. And so, at least in that respect, it's the generation of culture from its true root.
Yeah, and then as they progress, they start universities, they start colleges. All of our higher educations result.
Right. But let me ask you how then, and this isn't this.
Yeah, how they get to work.
I respect you, and also, as you well know, I like you. I also enjoy talking to you. So this isn't me just being a dick, right?
Mhm.
But for my audience, and to kind of take, if I were the devil's advocate playing AA's role, right? You just told me that all these university systems came out of this, and look what they've done to us today.
Exactly.
Look at what all the outcomes
Absolutely.
of exactly what you're talking about, how all of them have amounted to various species, at least recently, at least
It's
to
sewer
different
now. And those
perversion.
old ones like Harvard are the worst because the best got polluted first. And I've always said about communism, they appeal to the best in us, and that's how they get them young. They get some of the best people, like my mentor Carolina Robinson, who used to be a communist. So yes, it worked very well, but that's what I'm saying. It's a force to be reckoned with.
So tell me again how all these awakenings were a good thing.
Okay, well, the American Revolution was the only, to me, successful revolution. It was actually a success. It changed humanity. It changed culture. It's the great experiment that is still going on, even if it's polluted today. I agree. Right now, it looks it could be the end of it. Okay, but while it lasted, so what they said was, we don't need the King of England. We have our own. We don't need the Anglican Church. Well, who's the head of the Anglican Church? The King of England. So the next step was, well, if we don't need the Church of England, we don't need the head of the Church of England, we don't need the King of England. And this was a big and powerful thing that started moving among, and even the congregational churches. And the congregational people were some of these preachers were called the Black Regiment. They were the Black Robes, that they became instrumental in this revolution taking off and actually being perpetuated. So again, if you hate America, you'll hate the Great Awakenings. You'll poo-poo them. You'll say, oh, it's just, top down, whatever. If you think the Great American Experiment was, in fact, fantastic for humanity, maybe we're at the end of the road. Okay, fine. But if you believe it was, then we ended slavery. Now, we say the Englishmen, the Europeans had already got out of the slave trade, but that's not good enough because they didn't have a huge population of slaves.
Well, but remember that the Brits in the 1830s sailed all around the world, stopping people from trading in slaves. My own view of that.
Oh, they did. The English finally, it's the European. Oh, they stopped it in the Arabs.
Right. So basically, when you talk about we ended slavery, you're talking about Caucasians and Western Europeans. Right.
Christianity.
Absolutely, it's Christianity.
Christianity stopped slavery all over the world. Right today, our ancestors would brag, I got 50 slaves. And the guy said, that's nothing. I got 100. I got 5,000. Now, if you own slaves, you keep your mouth shut because it's illegal all over the world. Even if people think it's a great idea, they keep it.
Right. Though I want to emphasize that for the vast majority of Americans and for the vast majority of Southerners, most of them didn't own even a single slave.
No. Well, that's true. Yes, that's always
right. I just want to point it out because a lot of people seem to think the South was full of slave owners, and very few were actually.
No, but what I'm saying is that the Southern culture was in tune with the rest of the world. Slavery was not a bad thing. It was the order of things. It was the way it should be. If you could be enslaved, you should be. And with the Africans to this day, I met Father Tusameso, who let me know that in certain tribes there, the village, if you were a descendant of a slave, you could not occupy certain tribal positions. That's the contempt they had for him. The only reason Obama was accepted with celebration was because Obama was not born of a person who was a descendant of slaves. His father was African.
You mean the only reason he was accepted in Africa?
Right. The reason they celebrated, he's one of us, was because he was not the descendant of a slave. Because they don't have much respect for Black Africans on that account. And I've been told this by a number of Africans. Slavery was normal. Now it's seen as a criminality, as a criminal, terrible thing morally.
Yeah, although I have my
great reversal.
I tend to doubt that in large portions of Africa that anybody really views it as immoral still. But,
the Arabs don't. They can't because Muhammad owned slaves, never freed all of them, and never said it was evil. So if you're a Muslim, he was the perfect man. You cannot really say that slavery is evil.
Right. And let's not forget also that Jews owned slaves.
This treasurer of the Confederacy was a Jew. His name was Benjamin something.
Right. Which color me shocked. Although I'm certainly not suggesting that only that group has a love of the Gelt, right?
No, but they don't, they're not the victims of the world either. I mean, they help themselves just like everyone else did.
Right. So basically your view is that the Great Awakenings were a good thing because fundamentally there is progress with a capital P and you like it.
Yeah. So, and it's been usurped now and it's being ridden by these maniacs. And to your thing, it's the messianic impulse without Christianity.
So it's more or less like I was saying, it's a way of flattening religion in order to to keep some fundamental vestige of it that it will keep us engaged while continuing their own.
And it appeals to people now to save the world, to save. I mean, if you would have said to a Viking, "We're going to go save the world," he would have laughed at you. "What are you, fucking idiot? I'll save my family. I'm not going to save the world. I don't give a shit about the world." That took 1,000 years of Christianity to get people in the idea that this good for humanity, good for the whole world, salvation for it. Our ancestors would have laughed at that.
Right. I love the idea of putting all these people in a room because you'll have the American libertarian types, and I have some of that in me. Just for the record, right? I'm coming down on you to play devil's advocate.
I agree, and if I convince wrong, I'll become my next step is aristocracy.
Right. So and I'm
not convinced. I'm looking around and going, I struggle with this. 50% of the population has been duped in this idiocy.
Or maybe
that doesn't look good for what we call a republic or democracy. I'm sorry, it just
right. Certainly not for a republic. So I share with you some of that, but I also share with you the aristocratic take. And so it seems to me it'd be funny to have in a room. You have the American Great Experiment people, and then coming in on them, you'll have the high church monarchists who'll be like, "Fuck you, you ruined everything," right? And then in the back,
you heretic.
Right. And then you'll have a bunch of pagans who'll be like, "Fuck all of you with your Semitic religions, fundamentally your Abrahamic religions. You've destroyed everything."
There is no right wing. That's a delusion. That's what there is no. We are all over the map. There is, however, a left wing. The progressives are lockstep. They are lockstep in their maniacism, and they exist. We, on the other hand, this is our strength and weakness. We don't really exist. Just in the circles that we travel in, there's so much diversity of thought and opinions and approaches that say that there is a right wing is absurd. There is no right wing. Hopefully, we'll all be part of a resistance to the maniacs. But other than that, we don't have that much in common.
Certainly. And I want to underscore the point that I'm not wanting to purity spiral off into nowhere. Like you say, I think we need to make common cause. So, to a certain extent, I don't even care what everybody needs to do to work together. Whatever it is, they need to do it.
It's coming to the point we have to do it. Or if you have kids, somebody's going to be messing with them in that way, and that's really that's abominable. Send your kid to a school and it gets talked into becoming a girl. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. Well, let's just leave that be. Okay. Well, if you don't have any other specific point you want to raise, I'll just roll through here and see what kind of questions we can find. Is that all right? Is there anything?
Hopefully they were interested enough to ask a few.
Yeah. Oh, there's some up in here. Now, beyond a certain point, the furthest back I can go is to the furthest I can scroll backward. Let me make sure I'm on live chat. Whoops. I should be on live chat, not top chat. But it still doesn't let me really go back much further. Where is it? Did it just cut it down even more? The hell? I put it on live chat and I lost even more. Let me see if I can go. Oh, dirty dogs. Okay, everybody basically ask your damn questions again now because they all got erased. There's one I was just reading that makes sense to me that I remembered. I think it was BB, and I also think Travis Blaze was also asking for reading lists on this. And in Travis's case, Travis Blaze was asking about reading lists on the Great Awakening or a book or title.
Yeah, there's a number. I think I was pretty sloppy when I was doing those things, and I even put some of the books up, but it's not an esoteric subject.
Right.
And the
I was shocked to discover Turnip knew a lot about it. But certainly the Protestant Christians are well versed in it.
Yeah, but you know how I came across it? Interestingly enough, it was from an ethnomusicologist referring to it because she was talking about the relationship with emotions and music. And in my presentation, I talk about the importance of music that gets lost. In these Great Awakenings, music played a huge role in and you know how I like the Sacred Harp Singers. And one of the songs.
Me too. You introduced me to them. They're
Yeah, the
fucking
Chesterton
glorious.
song, they changed the words to be revolutionary. And the whole story of the Sacred Harp is beautiful. I really suggest anybody to understand the spirit of Great Awakenings, it's called Awake, O My Soul. And you can order the DVD. I don't know if they're sophisticated enough to have it digitized or not, but the whole history, or you can rent a movie, whatever. And it's the history of them. And I met some of those people because it was done recently. And you'll get a really good feeling for, okay, you can hate them or whatever, but you will understand the
power of it.
The power
when
of
you
it.
sent me a link of some of those, Sacred Harp is the same thing as shape note singing, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
so there was a particular way that they taught music to people who had not had exposure to it.
People.
Right.
Totally,
and the result, as they all form, and you know this, but just to let everybody who doesn't know about it, they form, they all fill a big room, and they make a square in the center with these sort of 4 sections running back, and they'll get a person up there who's doing these hand gestures for the notes.
Everybody gets to come into the center and direct. They choose the song and the verses, and then they lead it.
And man, there's like one of my favorites is, just as a spiritual song, I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger,
that's
passing through this world of woe. Anyway, I can't sing, but man, you hear these fucking songs and you're like, bam, like, oh, it's really powerful.
That was right before the American Revolution, and they were singing like that, and they were bringing these anthems to bear, and they changed the word of Chester, but one of the big composers, escaping me right now, but he took one of the songs, and of course the classic. He took one of those songs, and we put the revolutionary words to it. They're really good. They're really good about shaking the tyrant and fighting the tyrant, and then of course the song that keeps reappearing throughout America's history is "Amazing Grace." That is a shape note song, and it's
wasn't it about a slaver who was struck by a vision?
It was written by a slaver who had a
change of heart,
religious experience, a change of heart, swore he would never be a part of that again, and then he started preaching, and he wrote the words to "Amazing Grace," and it went through. They would trade the words around different tunes, and the tune was called "New Britain," which is another word for America. So really, it is kind of like one of the original great American anthems. Is actually "Amazing Grace." I guess is where the last time I heard it. I know people go, okay, I don't like Joan Baez. I know I do now. I started studying her, and now I do like her. At the time, those women with their silly waping voices, and social woes. But now I've looked back on her, and I kind of like her. But the last time I heard her sing this was, believe it or not, it was at Burning Man. And she was trying to get people to sing along, but they didn't know the words. They didn't like it.
See, this is what I love for a boomer. Like when they admit their secret evil truth that they've hidden in their heart, they'll be like, "Oh, I kind of did like Joan Baez."
No, not I couldn't stand her. It's
right,
now.
But as a Gen Xer, I have my version of that is now I'm like, I guess Depeche Mode wasn't that bad. I kind of like them. I never would have admitted it at the time. Same thing, different generations. Yeah, when we met each other, you were way into Sisters of Mercy.
Wasn't that song theirs?
I don't know. They did have one where they were playing kind of a Spanish guitar. I'm paralyzed. But anyway, in terms to come back to the original question, specifically for Travis Blaze asking about it, what books, can you remember them? Any titles, or should they just basically go and start with like a Wikipedia article on the Great Awakenings?
No, I would Google it. and go to some of the books I got were right out of Amazon, and they were good because I already knew about them. That's why I went there. So I would just save you those steps. Look through them, read up there. One of them is green that has I got them all in my RV because this one I did that. It was particularly good, but there's a number of them, and there's some real characters. I mean, some funny things. The guy took all off his clothes and burned it on the wharf in New York. And then some lady told him he was an idiot, and he kind of broke the spell, and he kind of repented and admitted he was going too far.
And yet today, the women want to run around naked the same damn way.
There's a lady
I'm not sure it was a good thing. I'm not sure it was a good thing.
So you saw that
I saw that clip, and you might want to take that down. I don't want to say, but
I'm not gonna take it down. I'll take down the whole video before I take that out. That's one of the best.
Well, just as long as you don't get a channel strike for nudity, but yeah, okay.
Hell, that was all over. I got
it doesn't matter. Don't look at you. You're so cute. You boomers are so cute. You're all like everybody else does it. Why would they come down on me? I'm like, because they have the friend enemy distinction. They'll crush you. And it will be
so far nobody said anything, but let's see.
As it's been expressed, it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. Okay, Mutant 12, who I've noticed has been doing all sorts of weird black and white pulls from my videos. I'm certainly not going to raise hell with him. I'm flattered that anybody cares to do it, but he pulls little segments out of these chats over on his channel. And he's also got a number of other people that he's done that with. And so they're interesting little pulls, excerpts from these longer distinctions. So check out Mutant 12. He says, talk to the chat about Metis. I don't have time this time, and that's outside our scope. But I did finally read that book, Cunning Intelligence in Greek Society. And I will be talking more about Metis, and it's going to be a major part of my whole thing on on a semiotics of nationalism. So stay tuned for that. Mutant 12. Travis Blaze says, so since we are essentially in quote unquote late stage Christianity, is a grassroots replacement going to arise other than this lunacy or a revival of Christianity in some form? What are your thoughts on the prospects for a revival of Christianity? And while you answer, I'll be away and I'll be right back.
Well, here's a shocking statistic. In China, as I said, all socialism manifests as fascism. They will, in fact, have a state-run religion because they know they have to, and they'll have state-controlled capitalism. And right now, Christianity is huge in China. And of course, this so-called Pope agreed to let the Communist Party decide who's going to be the bishop in China or the cardinals or whatever. So there's already massive revivals of Christianity going on. It's huge in Africa. It's gigantic, massive revivals going on there. South America, the Protestant revivalism is huge in South America. The Catholic Church is what's losing. And of course, the Catholic Church in the West is catastrophic. That's all I can say. I have personal experience with working, and that I'll do a video fairly soon when I get around to something I should have done years ago, where I worked with something called Faith in Organizations and just saw the universities working and weaseling through the so-called religious organizations. It was really eye-opening. So I guess what we're really concerned with is Christianity in the West done. I don't know. The Catholic Church, I don't know how it's going to survive this.
Yeah, what good does it do to us if the entire non-white world becomes Christian, and meanwhile we turn into God knows what,
Yeah, it's such a good question, and believe me, it's being asked all the time. It doesn't look good. In the West, it doesn't look good. The Catholic Church, I went on the Rocio, I went on this big, and that part of Andalusia, it's because rituals are alive. You see, I hope to do this quickly, okay? When the Golden Bough was written, Fraser thought that myth created ritual. Well, people who understand the relationship between experience and representation know, I instinctively knew that wasn't going to be right. But he wrote this way before my time. By the end, when he does his later editions, he corrects himself and says, no, actually, ritual creates myths, because myths are expressions of experiences that are then turned into myths to try to capture the memory, and rituals to try to induce or symbolize to different degrees. And that's where my ritual spiral comes into play. So what is the Catholic Church today? It is an intellectual institution, and that's why it's so easily polluted. The church in the medieval ages, the priests had this garden that was just overflowing. It was wild. Their job was to prune it so they could still call it Catholicism. Otherwise, it would just overrun its boundaries and become, well, it did. That's why we have Protestantism. Now, the Catholic Church, if there's one little tree that's still halfway alive, 5 priests are gathered around trying to water it and seeing if it'll stay alive. It's because they have the ritual system of the Catholic Church in the West is pretty much gone. And until that's revived, there will be no revival of Catholicism, period. It won't happen. And the reason that the Protestants are doing so well comparatively, especially the lower church, not the high churches, their Anglicans are gone, is because they keep going back to the experience of the Spirit. And that's why they're spreading in South America. That's why they spread in Africa. That's why they spread in China. These are actual revivalist movements where people must go out and seek experience and meditate and pray and sing, dance, whatever, and come to some kind of experience of the Spirit. However laughable you may find it, that's the bottom. That's religion from the grass up. And it's unstoppable too, I would say. So something I think is going to happen, whether it's Christianity, I don't know. It doesn't look good for Christianity. The high churches are pretty much dead. They're gone.
Well, I will say this. There are a bunch of people who are hardcore into Christianity, and at least in mine and AA circles. So I'd turn to people who want to know more about this. Take a look at people like, ask this question of Radlib, ask it of Lambda, ask it of Turnip, ask it of Apostolic Majesty, people who are much, much more closely focused on various
Christian.
Christian.
Are making the same mistake. There was a church, there was a Catholic college started by the guy who started Domino's Pizza. And it's in Florida, and I wrote them and I corresponded with them. It'll come to me the name of it again. But when I look at the curriculum, the emphasis is on spreading the word, religious, writing more. People, we have 2,000 years of commentaries on the Bible, of great books of the same. We don't need more of that. That's not why the church is falling apart. It's because they're not emphasizing ritual and the religious experience. People, medieval ages, they went to church for hours. They fasted. They had a ritual every single other day. You really have to go to southern Spain and go to Holy Week to get an idea that this was the normal life of all Catholic Europe. That's gone. Without that experiential dimension of the ritual system intact, you can write another 15,000 books on Christianity. And if you think that's going to make a dent, it's not.
I absolutely agree. And for people who are interested in this aspect of what Gerard is talking about, you can probably somewhere dig up his PhD dissertation. But we talk a little bit about these kinds of things in a previous appearance.
All that. I'm going to go back and do videos on it, explain it, and put
right.
it
but I did want to say there's more on your channel, and there is more along these lines, because it really underpins just about everything you do. If you know what you're looking for. But it also gets discussed. Gerard and I talked about this here on my channel under processions.
Yeah.
So we talked about some of these ritual aspects and their importance, this kind of thing. Mutant 12 asks, Semiagog, how influential is Ramus or Ramus's works? That's Petrus Ramus. And it's a very obscure aspect of mnemonics and logic that most people don't know about. I don't have time to go into it here, but there is a very interesting work by Ioan Culianu called The Tree of Gnosis, where he takes a look at binary forking pathways of logic and relates that to Gnosticism. So if you're interested in Petrus Ramus, Mutant 12, I would say check that out. It's called the Tree of Gnosis by Ioan Culianu, and you'll also find some discussion, if you haven't read it already, maybe you have, of Ramus and his position within historical developments related to the art of memory in Francis Yates' book, The Art of Memory. Okay, let's see here. I've just shout out to Zed Des in the chat, still helping out and sticking up stuff, support links for Subscribestar and everything. Thank you very much, Zed. Very happy to have you here as a moderator. 99 Iron Duke says, do you think there would have been a French Revolution without the American Revolution? I'll let you take that one, Gerard.
I would say yes, because the Masons were so involved in both of them. How influential we were on the French Revolution? I would say pretty massively, but again, and I know this sounds Pollyannic, ours was pushed by the Great Awakening. Ours was successful. Theirs was not. And it was catastrophic at every level. I mean, how can you have a French Revolution, murder most of the aristocracy, and I think within 30 years you crown an emperor? I mean, so they went there again. I think the American Revolution was the only successful revolution there's really ever been of a revolution that wanted to change the social order, not just getting rid of one king to put another one duke to another. Just a power struggle. Our revolution really did make a major change in humanity.
However, I would argue that it, if I may, I would argue that it did so simply because it moved just slightly. It's like your discussion about DNA, right?
Yeah.
They kept the monarch in the form of the executive, right?
Right.
They kept the parliament, the upper and lower chamber, right? Yeah. Or in the case of the United States, you could argue that both of them are lower chambers in some sense, right? They're more populist, right? Right. And they kept the English common law. So despite the fact that it was a major shift, they kept the same basic structures.
Right. It wasn't nearly the kind of, I mean, they said you cannot be an aristocrat. If you become an American citizen, you have to give up your title as an aristocrat. That's a far cry from killing all the aristocrats. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it was going to happen anyways because there were so many forces at work. Remember, there's the Jacobins already. Well, the Jacobins were later. They had a lot of forces already at work, and the Masons were working hard there. But the Masons worked hard in ours too. So it's you could argue that it might not have happened if the American Revolution had failed, for instance. Had we failed, then there's a good chance the French Revolution would not have taken off, maybe. But there were other forces there at work in Europe that, they kind of still had its own course. I wouldn't say that necessarily had we not won, they wouldn't have happened. What do you think?
I'm pretty much in the same position with you. I think something, there was going to be some kind of upheaval there. And well, let me put it like this. My best guess, and it's not really a finished guess, how do I say this? My best way to point you to my own developing thoughts about all of this is the Light and Darkness series that I did with Anteos, because we start with the period of Platonists like Gemistos Platon coming out of Constantinople shortly before the Turks took it over, and coming over to Florence under Marsilio Ficino, influencing people like Lorenzo Alberti and Pico della Mirandola. And we look at the way Platonism comes in. Anteos does just a fantastic job. He's carrying the majority of the weight with that. So in some of the earlier episodes, I was, shoulder to shoulder with him, but particularly as we get into the later periods, it's all his scholarship and research. And basically we track it from the Florentine Neoplatonists. And again, later, mainly Anteos tracks it, coming all the way up. I think at this point we got up through the period after the French Revolution. I think the next one we're going to probably have to do is World War I. But basically, we took a look at the intersection of secret societies and secret services, going all the way back to the Florentine Neoplatonists. And then we look at the Rosicrucians. We look at the Illuminati in Germany. We look at the French Revolution. I think the last one we looked at, if I'm remembering correctly, was the Paris Commune. So we're going to move to, I think, to World War I next. But if you want to know about this idea of the French Revolution and the American and all of that in the context of things like the Masons and the ideology behind it, the behind the scenes international movements, I would point you to the Light and Darkness series. And that's a playlist. You can find it here on my channel. Rockhopper1163 is saying, Semiagog, what do you think about the mouse utopian experiment? Do you think we are currently living it? For example, feminine males, aggressive females, lack of interest in reproducing, and using that as a parallel for Western civilization. I'm not familiar with that. Are you, Gerard?
No, the mouse
utopian experiment is what it's called.
No, it sounds like they did something with mice and they probably just became degenerate and pleasure seeking. That's got a long history. You don't have to go to mice for
that. Yeah, you sure don't. So sorry, I can't answer that one. Rockhopper1163. Sorry. If I knew anything about it, I'd hazard a response, but I just don't. Hairway to Steven says, Semiagog, were you a member of Crash Worship? Absolutely not. I met all the guys from that a couple different times. More than a couple, probably 3 different times as they toured around the country, different years. I'd go and talk to them. I knew some people and was friends with people in their crew. And I got along pretty well with Marcus. But no, of course, I was not a member of Crash Worship. Let's see what our next... do we have no more questions? All right. Well, I'm going to give it just a minute to see if anybody comes in with any last questions, Gerard. And while we're doing that, waiting to see if anybody wants to throw in their last questions. Is there anything else you wanted to cover, sir?
No, I think we did a good job.
I think you certainly did a good job. You're a fine gentleman. Fine gentleman.
Good judge, even though I didn't have any today.
Well, hardly. Yeah. Let's see here. It looks like there might be a few. Yeah, I'm sorry, people. My chat is all over the place in terms of its refresh. It looks like we have 1 or 2 last questions. Yeah, okay. So the first one, this is from Dagbreker. I wonder how you that must be Dutch. Has to be Dutch. South African, Afrikaans, Flemish or something. Dagbreker. Sounds like Daybreaker, right? Right? Must be. What do you think, comparing the eugenics idea with the breeding of... What do you think of comparing the eugenics idea with the breeding of chickens as capital? For example, laying eggs and eating the chicken being our current socialist order being introduced. So I guess he's saying, if you were to think about socialism, if I'm interpreting this right, what do you make of the idea of keeping the chicken so that it will lay the eggs versus killing the goose that laid the golden eggs, which seems to fit rather well.
The children too.
Yeah, Kronos or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting metaphor because I think he's hinting at that he's seeing it that it really is way more nefarious than just we want to make a better we want to breed, we want to have strong families, cunning people, beautiful, fecund, women, strong, virile men like us.
So fecund women. Tell me again.
Yeah, that it's way beyond that. That's not what's going on, and so it's well taken that you could use a lot of metaphors like that. That it's nefarious, and I think that's whatever metaphors we come up with. I think most sane people will look at this and what's going on in the schools right now with Planned Parenthood and see it as something so nefarious that it's almost, defies, you want to start saying it's satanic, you
want to run around in the streets shrieking, we are all Soylent Green. Yeah. I put a meme out about it. Most people who, followed me on Twitter or whatever, they've seen it. I have basically a goose with a golden egg behind it, and above it, it just says whiteness. Because, obviously that's a white goose, and in fact, by trying to get rid of whiteness, they are going after the goose that laid the golden egg. So there is some dimension of that seems to be fundamentally,
we could have a good discussion at some point about how, because I have such firsthand account of this, how critical race theory works, so that when they tell you they don't teach that in schools, that's right, they don't. That's the whole brilliant. And so we could have at some point a good discussion on that, because it's very simple once you understand how it works. And yeah, they don't have to teach it. They don't teach it.
Well, then let's turn to the. We're about to wrap up here, but there's interesting question here from Cyberpunk Internal Affairs channel supporter, the one responsible for the excellent interpretation of the Anvil of Crom soundtrack at the beginning. So yeah, thanks as always, Cyberpunk Internal Affairs. He says, what is the next stream with Jolly Scholar 888? You have any ideas for what we'll talk about next?
Well, there's that one with the, like I said, we could do the critical race. We could do it after. I think at some point this would be a little bit more a future when I do the ritual spiral. I actually start doing videos and with, I'm hiring an animist to actually animate it so you can see it.
Animator, not an animist. You're like, The Rock has a soul. I got a job for you, man.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, right. Sorry. An animator. And then I think it would be a really good subject and see what people think about that, because that's really would be the other one is those music and the the role of music and consciousness would be a good discussion.
Yeah, both of those are right at the heart of the work you did. So yeah, we've talked about that in the past, but Gerard and I are basically holding off on that because he's going to put some stuff up on his channel first to set a context for the ideas and the rest, and then we'll discuss it further. But I'm always happy to have him on, so you can be sure that there will be further discussions, barring force majeure, the internet going down or one or the other of us croaking. So yeah, we will be talking in future, and we will work that out. Next questions here. Just a quick one, because this is from Palooka82, longtime channel follower, so I don't want to just chuck this out. I don't know how to answer this, but if you got a quick answer for it, Gerard, how would you defend against people who tell you eugenics is not happening and that it's a conspiracy theory? How would you answer them?
Oh, it's very simple. If you don't believe me, go to Planned Parenthood's, and of course, in this video, I'm going to show you. Go to the website, go to gender affirming therapy, and then go to the it's a 4-letter acronym, and it's specifically that they are putting clinics into the schools, and one of the first ones was in where else? Los Angeles. This is already underway. These clinics are there, and gender affirming therapy, and of course, the abortion and contraceptives is there, but that's actually, to me, it's a cover. It's really the LGBT thing. That's really what they're putting into the school system, and you'll see this with your own eyes. They're not hiding it. You can go and you can read about it.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I'll just throw this in here. I don't know what the best answer is. If I had a little bit of time, I could probably come up with some reasonable attempts. Excuse me. But from my point of view, it's like, why do you want to argue with them? Who cares? If at this point they can't see what's right in front of their faces, I have to kind of wonder whether or not you want to put that time and effort in. John Fraser asks, what are the upcoming streams? Well, in just 2 or 3 days, I'm going to be talking on Wednesday the 14th with Jimmy Thomas, who has had staff officer training and has done some really interesting work with maps of Ukraine and that general region as a way to understand what's going on there, not just reporting on what other people have said, but actually doing an operational breakdown of the battle space, or the campaign space, I suppose I should say. And we'll be joined by Prudentialist. So on the 14th, Wednesday, just a few days away, at, let's see here, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, I will be talking with Prudentialist and Jimmy Thomas about Ukraine to revisit what's going on there with Russia, which seems very much timely insofar as we've seen major changes there with the Kharkov area that Russia had control over, being sort of relinquished by them, and they pulled up to the river there as a defensive line. Then on the 23rd, I will be doing a stream with Loud Sound Epicenter and my buddy Menton Matthews, and with Martin Lichtmetz out of Austria. It is called Goth Stream. And I will be talking with, I'm a Gen X goth, although back in my day we called it death rock. Martin Lichtmetz, who I did a stream with him called Neo Folk, going into like Nurse with Wound and Death in June and Current 93. He's joining us again. So yeah, Loud Sound Epicenter.
Industrial Gothic.
Indeed.
They didn't call it that. What about Sisters of Mercy?
Well, no, Sisters of Mercy was death rock. And then later, I guess after the fact, they called it goth. But yeah, and then so Loud Sound Epicenter is basically a Zoomer, former goth. My buddy
Negative, wasn't that?
Yep, that fits in there. Menton Matthews is like a millennial or late Gen X goth, but he's more sort of the Marilyn Manson skinny puppy period, right? But he also had his own goth band. And then there's me and Martin Lichtmetz. We're both Gen X death rockers and neo-folk people. So all four of us are going to be getting together to talk about goths. And I expect there will be a detailed consideration of the phenomenon of the goth girl as a part of that discussion.
My favorite.
Yes, what is the long-standing attraction of the goth girl? So that will be happening on Friday the 23rd. We're having to corral a number of people in different time zones. So I believe that is... man, wait till I put it up, because I didn't make a note here to myself. My problem is I plan everything based on Eastern time zone, but now I'm in Central. So sometimes it's my own screw up. I put up my times in Central, sometime in Eastern. So it's either going to be 3 or 4 p.m. Eastern on Friday the 23rd. The goth stream will be happening, and there are a couple of others behind the scenes that I'm trying to put together, but those are the two immediate, and there's going to be an Ask Me Anything in there before too long. So Wednesday the 14th, Russia Revisited. Friday the 23rd, there will be the goth stream.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it should be fun. So yeah, that's what's coming up next for me. It looks like,
by the way, it's SBHC, school-based health centers. And if he looks those up,
you're talking about how to push back against the idea that it's,
well, for him, send him to go read about that. And I think that you should argue with these people, because it's 50-50 in this nation. If we want to avoid a civil war, we're going to have to pull a certain portion of them over. Otherwise, it's going to be a civil war. We cannot allow this to happen. And if the voting isn't going to do it, then we're going to have to do something else.
Right. And so, yeah, yes. And you will see that over on Gerard's channel, that he very consciously and intentionally positions himself to pull liberals in. So you'll see the same attitude that is reflected here in his observation reflected over on his channel. He's like, why make enemies of people if you don't have to? Bring them over to your side, do what you can with them. And I think that's an important part of the program too. So
I'm just hoping they're not as stupid as they seem.
Yeah. And I guess
that could be wrong, and well, what do you do?
Right. Okay. Well, then do you have any further things you want to add, Gerard?
Nope. It was a great conversation. I said everything I had to say.
I'm very, very happy to have you here. I want to go ahead along those lines and encourage everybody to go check out Jolly Scholar 888. You've got a link for his channel down in the description below. I am not currently on Twitter, though. I suppose eventually I will be back. Yeah. Oh, God, it's so degrading to have to acknowledge their shit. But then on the other hand, you're like, do I want to turn loose of 8,000 subscribers that I can, reach if I'm trying to? Anyway, yeah, that's how they hook you, man. That's how they hook you. I see Philosopher Cat is in the chat calling me Santa. Fuck you very much. I mean, just joking. PCAT is definitely one of my peeps. But yeah, I ain't no goddamn Santa Claus. Gerard, thank you
Her,
very.
great channel. I totally recommend it. I watch it a lot.
Yeah, she's got great stuff on Evola.
Great stuff,
Absolutely. And follow her over on Telegram, because she has actually been shuffled out of Twitter. So if you want to follow Philosophicat, don't get her started on which one is correct. You can follow her over on YouTube as well as on Telegram. So yeah, before we bore everybody to death, Gerard, thank you very, very much for coming on today, and we'll get together in future. Everybody, thanks for watching us this evening. Buy my book, subscribe to my channel, subscribe to me on Twitter, on Telegram, on Gab, all that good stuff on Odyssey. And we will be back sometime soon. Oh, last thing. Thank you again also to Zedez and any other moderators in the house. So yeah, until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.